There is a particular kind of man the 20th century produced in great numbers, and then spent the rest of its years trying to understand. A man shaped not by what he chose, but by what he was handed. The literature, the uniform, the oath, the enemy. A man who could be genuinely brave and genuinely monstrous, sometimes in the same afternoon. A man whose story does not resolve into something clean or simple, no matter how long you sit with it. Kurt Meyer was that kind of man. He was not a figure who lurked in the background of history. He was not a bureaucrat in a distant office signing documents he never had to see acted upon. He was present. He was loud. He was, by almost every account from friend and enemy alike, the kind of soldier other soldiers noticed when he walked into a room. He earned his nicknames the hard way, leading from the front, moving fast, thinking fast, demanding the same from every man beneath his command. His troops called him Panzer Meyer. The name was not given lightly. And yet, on the roads and in the fields, around a small French village in the summer of 1944, men under his command executed prisoners, young Canadians, soldiers who had already surrendered, who had already laid down whatever slim chance of survival combat had left them. They were killed not in the confusion of a firefight, but in the aftermath, deliberately, at close range, as a matter of practice. Not once, not as an isolated incident of one man losing control. It happened in a pattern. It happened repeatedly, and it happened under Kurt Meyer's command. That is what this documentary is about. Not the mythology, not the iron crosses and the panzer charges and the combat decorations that filled his service record. Like entries in a ledger nobody ever thought to audit. This is about all of it, the whole arc, from the beginning to the end. From the boy who grew up in the wreckage of a defeated Germany, to the man who stood before a court and heard the word guilty read aloud in a language he did not speak. Because you cannot understand what happened in Normandy without understanding what came before. You cannot understand what the Hitler-Jugend division was without understanding what the Hitler Youth was designed to produce. You cannot understand how teenagers became killers without understanding the machine that told them killing was a form of virtue. And you cannot understand Kurt Meyer without understanding that he was not simply a monster who appeared from nowhere. He was a product, a highly refined, carefully constructed product of a system that had been working on him since he was barely old enough to march in formation. That is the part that should keep you awake, or rather, the part worth carrying with you before you drift off tonight. Not the horror of it in isolation, but the mechanism of it. The way ordinary processes, ordinary ambitions, ordinary loyalties to a unit, and a flag, and a comrade standing next to you. The way all of that can be redirected, weaponized, turned toward ends that nobody in that chain of ordinary moments ever had to fully name out loud. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it just accumulates, one small decision at a time, until the accumulation becomes something that cannot be undone. Over the next several hours, we are going to walk through that accumulation together. 18 chapters. From Weimar, Germany to the courtroom in Aurich. From a young man with nothing but uncertainty in front of him, to a convicted war criminal whose death sentence was commuted by the same men who prosecuted him, in one of the stranger postscripts the Cold War era ever produced. The full story, the complete history. If you are new here, this is the kind of place you want to be. Long-form documentary narration, carefully researched, designed for the hours when the world gets quiet and the mind wants something to settle into, something real, something that matters, told at the pace it deserves. Take a moment now and subscribe if you have not already. It costs you nothing, and it means the next time we put something like this together, it finds its way to you. That is the only way these stories keep getting told. For those of you who have been here before, settle in, get comfortable. This one runs long because it has to. Kurt Meyer's story cannot be compressed without losing something essential, and what gets lost when you compress a story like this is usually the part that explains everything. We begin in Germany, between the wars, in the grey, exhausted country that emerged from the wreckage of 1918, with its army dissolved, its currency eventually obliterated by inflation, its people carrying a wound they had been told was a betrayal rather than a defeat. This is the world Kurt Meyer was born into and grew up inside, not the Third Reich that came later, the earlier world, the uncertain one, the one that made the Third Reich feel, to millions of people, like an answer. Understanding that feeling, not endorsing it, not explaining it away, but genuinely understanding how it worked and who it worked on, is where every honest account of this period has to begin. Because the crimes that happened in Normandy, in the summer of 1944, were not spontaneous. They were not random. They were the far end of a chain that began decades earlier, in classrooms and parade grounds and meeting halls, in the careful construction of young men who had been taught that certain lives were worth more than others, and that the rules governing how soldiers treated one another in wartime were the soft conventions of a world their movement had already left behind. Kurt Meyer believed those things. He acted on them. And when the moment came, when exhausted, frightened, fanatically trained teenagers, under his authority, had enemy soldiers in their hands, the orders that should have protected those prisoners either did not come, or came too late, or were never meant to come at all. A Canadian court eventually decided which of those it was. We will get there. But first, the beginning, the boy, the country, the movement that found him before he was old enough to understand what it was asking him to become. This is the complete history of Kurt Meyer, Panzer Meyer, commander of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, decorated soldier, convicted war criminal, one of the most complicated and troubling figures the Second World War produced. Let us start at the start. Germany, 1925, a country that had lost everything and was still counting the cost. The trenches of the Western Front had swallowed a generation, the Kaiser had fled, and what replaced the empire was a republic so fragile it seemed to tremble with every gust of political wind. The streets of its cities carried the residue of defeat, men who had marched away as soldiers and returned as ghosts, their medals worth less than the paper currency crumbling in their wallets. Into this fractured world, a child was growing up. His name was Kurt Meyer, and the Germany he inherited was not the Germany his father's generation had been promised. It was a nation learning to survive its own humiliation, and that education would mark him for life. He was born in the town of Jerxheim, in the region of Lower Saxony, in the year 1910. His family was working class in the most unadorned sense, not comfortable, not aspirational by the standards of the middle bourgeoisie, but rooted in the practical rhythms of German provincial life. His father had served in the war, as almost every father had, and the shroud of that service fell across the household as it fell across nearly every home in the country. Meyer grew up absorbing the particular grief of a household shaped by conflict, by loss, and by the simmering conviction that the sacrifice had been betrayed. He was not unusual in this. He was, in many ways, perfectly ordinary, which is precisely what makes his story worth examining with such care. The Weimar Republic offered a version of modernity that was, for many working-class Germans, more bewildering than liberating. Cities like Berlin pulsed with artistic energy and political violence in roughly equal measure. Unemployment spiked and crashed and spiked again. The hyperinflation of the early 1920s had already destroyed the savings of the middle and working classes before Meyer was even a teenager, and the Great Depression arriving at the end of the decade delivered a second, devastating blow. Factories closed, queues formed outside employment offices and stretched around corners. The institutions that were supposed to hold society together, the unions, the churches, the moderate political parties, all seemed inadequate to the scale of the collapse. For a young man watching this from the provinces, the question was not whether the Republic had failed. The question was what came next. It was in this atmosphere of collective anxiety and wounded national pride that the National Socialist movement found its most fertile ground. Adolf Hitler and his party did not need to manufacture despair in 1930s Germany. They merely needed to channel it, to name a villain, and promise a restoration. The movement offered young men in particular something that the Weimar Republic had conspicuously failed to provide: belonging, purpose, physical discipline, and the intoxicating sensation of being part of something that was going to matter. The Hitler Youth, formally organized and expanded during this period, was the mechanism through which that promise was extended to the youngest generation. For boys in towns like Jerxheim, it was often the most vivid and exciting thing available to them. That was not accidental. Meyer joined the movement in his teenage years, at a point when joining felt less like a political decision and more like the natural current of the world around him. The Hitler Youth was not, in its early years, experienced as an instrument of terror by those inside it. It was experienced as camaraderie, as camping trips and marching songs, and the sharp pleasure of physical competition. Boys who had grown up in households where money was short and horizons were narrow suddenly found themselves part of an organization with uniforms, with hierarchy, with the sense that their energy and loyalty meant something. Meyer took to it with evident enthusiasm. He was physically capable, naturally assertive, and possessed of the kind of direct, commanding presence that organizations built around hierarchy tend to reward quickly. What the Hitler Youth was doing to those boys was not hidden, exactly, but neither was it fully legible to them in the moment. The ideological content was woven into the texture of daily life, into the songs, the ceremonies, the framing of history lessons and physical training alike. It did not arrive as a lecture, it arrived as an atmosphere, as an assumption so pervasive that questioning it would have felt like questioning gravity. By the time a boy like Meyer reached his late teens, certain ideas had been deposited so deeply that they functioned less like opinions and more like instincts. The nation was a living organism. Struggle was the engine of all history. Loyalty to the movement was inseparable from loyalty to Germany itself. These were not conclusions he had reasoned his way toward. They were simply the furniture of his mind. The leaders of the Hitler Youth understood that ideology alone was insufficient. What they were building was not a debating society. The physical training regimen was deliberate and demanding, designed to produce young men who were physically hardened, pain-tolerant, and habituated to the rhythms of quasi-military discipline long before they ever saw a barracks. Boys learned to orienteer through terrain, to endure cold and wet and exhaustion, to function as units rather than as individuals. By the time Meyer came into leadership positions within the organization, which he did at a relatively young age, consistent with the pattern of an ambitious young man, rising through a hierarchical structure that valued visible dominance, he had absorbed not just the ideology, but the methodology. He had learned how to make other young men follow him, and he had learned that they would follow further and harder if they had already been conditioned to equate discomfort with virtue. There is a particular kind of violence that organizations do to young people without ever raising a hand against them. It is the violence of narrowing, The Hitler Youth did not merely teach boys to be soldiers. It systematically closed off the imaginative space in which other possibilities might exist. A boy who had been camping and marching and singing about blood and soil since the age of 10 had not been given the chance to develop the kind of inward skepticism, the capacity for moral friction that might have slowed him down later when orders arrived that crossed lines a more uncertain man might have hesitated at. Meyer was a product of this narrowing, as much as he was a product of any military gift or personal ambition. The two things were, by design, impossible to separate. By the mid-1930s, Germany's political landscape had resolved itself with brutal clarity. The Republic was dead, the National Socialists held power, and the machinery of the state had been turned toward their purposes, with remarkable efficiency. For a young man who had organized his entire adolescence around the movement that now ran the country, the trajectory was clear. The next step was not a decision that required much deliberation. The paramilitary energy of the Hitler Youth pointed in one obvious direction, toward a uniform, toward a weapon, toward an institution that could absorb and formalize the training and loyalty he had already given years of his life to developing. Meyer stood at that threshold, still young, still rising, and still entirely unable to see what that path would eventually demand of him. What the 1930s made of Kurt Meyer was not a monster in the making, in any simple or satisfying sense. That framing flatters everyone else and explains nothing. What the decade made of him was something both more ordinary and more alarming. A young man whose ambitions, loyalties, and moral reflexes had been calibrated with extraordinary care by an ideological machine that knew exactly what it was building. The cruelties of the Weimar years, the shame of Versailles, the grinding poverty of the Depression, these were not excuses, they were conditions. They were the soil in which a particular kind of soldier grew, not despite the system around him, but because of it, watered by it, shaped by its specific pressures into something the system had always intended to produce. He had not yet fired a weapon in combat. He had not yet commanded men under fire. He had not yet stood in any of the fields and villages where his name would eventually become inseparable from something that cannot be undone. All of that was still ahead, but the formation was largely complete. The beliefs were in place. The habits of command were in place. The capacity for moral compartmentalization, for separating the clean mechanical pleasure of military effectiveness from its human consequences, had been carefully installed. When the moment came to test all of it, he would not hesitate. He had been taught not to. That, perhaps, is the most important thing the early years of Kurt Meyer's life reveal. Not what one man became, but how completely, how patiently, and how deliberately a system can construct the men it needs. By the early 1930s, the National Socialist movement had grown far beyond a political party. It had become an ecosystem, a self-sustaining world of uniforms, rituals, hierarchies, and belonging that offered young men like Kurt Meyer something the crumbling Weimar Republic could not: certainty. For a generation raised on economic humiliation, the sting of the Versailles settlement, and the sight of fathers unable to put food on the table, the structured world of Nazi organization was not merely attractive, it was intoxicating. Meyer had moved through the Hitler Youth with the kind of restless energy that catches the attention of those looking upward, not merely sideways. He was the type of young man that the machinery of National Socialism was specifically designed to identify: physically capable, ideologically pliable, ambitious, and hungry for a sense of purpose that ordinary civilian life could not provide. When the SS came calling, it was not a sudden disruption to his trajectory. It was the next logical step on a path that had been quietly prepared for him for years. The Schutzstaffel, or SS, presented itself to the world as something apart from ordinary military or political organizations. Heinrich Himmler had spent years constructing an image of the SS as a racial and ideological elite, a brotherhood of Germany's finest, selected not merely for willingness, but for perceived biological and moral superiority. Entry was not automatic, even for enthusiastic young Nazis. Candidates faced physical examinations, genealogical scrutiny stretching back multiple generations, height requirements, and assessments of ideological commitment. The process was designed to reinforce the sense that belonging to the SS was an honor earned rather than simply granted. For Meyer, who had already demonstrated his credentials through the Hitler Youth movement and shown the kind of decisive, forward character that SS recruiters prized, acceptance into this world must have felt like confirmation of everything he had been told about his own potential. He crossed from the world of political soldiering into something that explicitly positioned itself as Germany's most elite human institution. Within the SS, Meyer found his path leading into the SS Verfügungstruppe, the armed, militarized wing of the organization that would eventually evolve into what the world came to know as the Waffen-SS. The Verfügungstruppe occupied an interesting and sometimes awkward position within Nazi Germany's military landscape. They were not the Wehrmacht, the regular German army with its traditions, its officer corps culture, its institutional memory reaching back through the imperial era. They were something newer, something designed from the beginning, with ideological formation as a core component alongside combat readiness. The tension between these two purposes, military effectiveness and ideological purity, ran through the Verfügungstruppe like a fault line, and Meyer's career would be shaped by exactly that tension for the rest of his life. He was entering an organization that wanted warriors who could also be true believers, and it was not always clear which demand took precedence. The training Meyer underwent with the Verfügungstruppe was, by the standards of the era, genuinely rigorous. The SS did not simply want fanatics in uniform. Himmler and his subordinates understood that ideological commitment alone did not win battles, and considerable effort went into producing soldiers with real military skills alongside their indoctrination. Physical conditioning was relentless. Small unit tactics, weapons handling, navigation, fieldcraft, these were drilled with the kind of repetitive intensity that builds instinct rather than conscious thought. Meyer absorbed this training with apparent enthusiasm. His Hitler Youth background had already given him a foundation of physical discipline and group organization, and the military dimension built naturally on that base. In the training environment, he began to distinguish himself, not merely as a capable student, but as a natural leader, someone others oriented toward, someone whose confidence in uncertain situations seemed to stabilize those around him. Promotion within the early SS was partly meritocratic and partly a function of exactly the personal impression one made on superiors. The organization was young enough in the mid-1930s that there was no vast established hierarchy to climb through slowly. Energetic, capable men could advance with a speed that the traditional military structures of the Wehrmacht would never have permitted. Meyer proved adept at navigating this environment. He cultivated the right relationships, performed well in the exercises and assessments that shaped careers, and demonstrated the kind of aggressive confidence that the SS valued in its junior leaders. Each promotion brought new responsibilities and new visibility, drawing him further into the inner world of the organization's military arm, and further from any future in which he might simply have been an ordinary German with an ordinary life. There was, however, a complication beneath the surface of this rising career, one that would define the moral ambiguity at the heart of Meyer's story. The SS was not merely a military organization. It was the enforcement arm of a regime that had already begun moving towards systematic persecution. The concentration camp system was expanding. The legal apparatus stripping Jewish Germans of their rights was deepening. The racial ideology that the SS embodied in its very entry requirements was not theoretical. It was being translated into policy, into law, into violence, administered by men who wore the same uniform as Kurt Meyer. How aware he was of the full scope of what his organization was enabling in these years is a question the historical record answers only partially. What is clear is that his career advanced within this context, and the ideological framework he trained within was inseparable from those realities. The professional pull of genuine military expertise also shaped these years. The Verfügungstruppe, as it developed, began incorporating officers with serious conventional military backgrounds, men whose expertise in artillery, armor, logistics, and operational planning went beyond anything that ideological training alone could produce. Meyer encountered this world of professional military knowledge and responded to it. He developed a particular fascination with mobile warfare, the concept of using speed, surprise, and concentrated force to disrupt and defeat an enemy before they could organize a coherent response. This was not yet the fully theorized armored doctrine that would define the early war years, but the intellectual foundations were being laid, and Meyer positioned himself to absorb them. In his mind, the SS ideal of the aggressive, decisive warrior and the professional military ideal of the skilled tactician were not in conflict. He could be both, and intended to be. By the late 1930s, Meyer had moved through junior and mid-level ranks with a momentum that attracted notice. He had proven himself in training environments and in the administrative leadership of his units. The men under his command responded to him with a mixture of respect and something approaching devotion. He was the kind of officer who led from the front, who shared conditions with his soldiers rather than managing them from a distance, and who projected an almost theatrical confidence that younger men found compelling. This personal style was not accidental. It was partly natural temperament, but it was also a performance that Meyer had learned to cultivate, understanding instinctively that in the SS world of competing ambitions and visible personalities, the man who looked and acted the part of a warrior leader was the man who advanced. There was a darker current beneath the esprit de corps and the tactical enthusiasm. The culture Meyer was embedded in actively discouraged the kind of moral questioning that might have acted as a brake on what was to come. The SS institutional culture rewarded decisiveness and penalized hesitation. It celebrated hardness as a virtue and treated mercy toward enemies, and the regime defined enemies broadly as weakness, as a failure of the ideological formation the organization worked so hard to instill. Young men, who might in other circumstances have developed a more measured ethical framework, were instead immersed in an environment where cruelty could be reframed as strength, where violence toward designated enemies could be discussed as professional necessity, and where the chain of command was treated as a moral authority in itself. For Meyer, ambitious and rising, this was the water he swam in. The entry into actual combat would come soon enough, and with it, the test of everything the Verfügungstruppe had built in its training halls and parade grounds. But before the first shots were fired in anger, Meyer spent these years being shaped in ways that could not easily be undone. The ideological formation was not a thin coat of paint over a conventional soldier. It was structural. It was built into the way he understood loyalty, authority, the definition of an enemy, and the acceptable boundaries of warfare. Even as he developed genuine military skills, and he did develop them, those skills were embedded within a value system that would eventually prove catastrophic. for thousands of Canadian prisoners of war, for a generation of young men he commanded, and ultimately for himself. What the SS had offered Kurt Meyer was everything a young man of his background and temperament could have wanted: belonging, purpose, advancement, camaraderie, the thrill of being told that he was among Germany's finest. What it required in return was a surrender of individual moral judgment to the collective authority of the organization and the regime it served. Meyer made that exchange, as thousands of other young men made it, gradually and incrementally, rather than in a single dramatic moment of decision. Each rank earned, each training exercise passed, each oath sworn, was another step deeper into an institution from which the cost of exit grew increasingly prohibitive. By the time real war arrived, he was not a man who had chosen to serve a criminal state. He was a man who no longer experienced that description as meaningful. The SS was not something he had joined. By now, it was something he had become. The 1st of September, 1939. Before dawn had fully broken over the Polish frontier, artillery opened up along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers. German armored columns rolled east across flat agricultural land, and among the soldiers moving with them was a young SS officer who had spent years preparing for exactly this kind of moment. Kurt Meyer had trained for war with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and now the abstract had become concrete. The noise, the smoke, the chaos of real combat, none of it seemed to unsettle him in the way it unmade other men. If anything, those who served alongside him would later recall that the beginning of the war seemed to sharpen him, the way cold weather sharpens the edge of a blade. Meyer was part of the SS Verfügungstruppe, the armed formation of the SS that moved alongside the Wehrmacht into Poland. These were not concentration camp guards or administrative personnel. They were trained fighting soldiers, equipped and organized to operate in direct combat, though their command authority and relationship to the regular army remained a source of persistent friction. The Wehrmacht's professional officer class had never fully accepted the SS formations as equals, viewing them as ideological projects dressed in uniforms rather than genuine military units. Meyer, for his part, had little patience for that contempt. He intended to demonstrate something through this campaign, not simply to his superiors, but to every skeptic who had ever questioned whether SS soldiers could fight. The campaign in Poland lasted barely more than 5 weeks before organized Polish resistance collapsed. For the men of the SS formations, it was a brutal education in the mechanics of modern combined arms warfare. Armor, infantry, and artillery had to be coordinated at speed across terrain that didn't cooperate. Communications broke down. Orders arrived late or not at all. Junior officers were required to make decisions without guidance and live with the results. Meyer thrived in exactly these conditions. His approach to command was fundamentally improvisational. He moved forward rather than back. He sought contact rather than avoided it. And he communicated not through lengthy reports, but through presence. His men saw him in the fighting, not behind a map table, and that simple fact built a loyalty that staff college theories about leadership rarely captured. What was also happening in Poland, however, was something Meyer would not have publicly acknowledged then, and which the comfortable mythologies around his later career would often attempt to obscure. Behind the advancing German military columns, a parallel campaign was already underway. SS units, Einsatzgruppen, and in some cases regular military formations, participated in the systematic terrorizing of the Polish civilian population. Polish intellectuals, clergy, Jews, and anyone deemed a potential obstacle to German occupation were being rounded up, shot, and disposed of in organized operations that had nothing to do with military necessity. The men carrying out these actions were often drawn from the same ideological ecosystem as Meyer, shaped by the same institutions and the same beliefs. The war they were fighting had two faces, and pretending to see only one required a particular kind of deliberate blindness. Meyer's own direct involvement in the specific atrocities of the Polish campaign is not established with the same clarity as his later conduct in Normandy. What is clear is that he operated in an environment where such things were happening around him, where the orders authorizing them came from the same chain of command that directed his military operations, and where raising objections would have been both career-ending and genuinely dangerous. The SS was not an institution that tolerated internal dissent, particularly from officers who had been trusted with command authority. The system was designed to make complicity the path of least resistance, and Meyer was moving through it with the wind at his back. After Poland, the pattern of his career continued eastward in both geography and ambition. The campaigns that followed deepened his combat experience across different terrains and against different opponents. He developed a reputation that was spreading through SS circles, an officer who led from the front, who understood the psychology of young soldiers better than most, and who could extract aggressive action from his men, even under conditions of extreme stress. Those qualities were genuinely valuable in a fighting force, and the SS leadership recognized them. Promotions followed, commendations followed, and with each step upward, Meyer moved deeper into a system where military excellence and ideological criminality were not separate categories, but intertwined threads. There was also something worth observing about the way Meyer processed the war intellectually. He was not a reflective man in any literary sense. He left no substantial philosophical writing, no private journals full of anguished self-examination. His orientation was entirely practical and forward-looking. The mission, the next objective, the coordination of his units, the morale of his men, these were the matters that occupied him. The broader moral architecture of the war he was fighting, the question of whether any of it was justified, or what it meant for the people on the receiving end of German military power, these were questions he did not appear to ask. That absence of self-examination was not unique to him. It was, in many ways, the defining psychological feature of the SS officer class. The Eastern campaigns also brought Meyer into proximity with a set of tactical lessons that he would carry forward for the rest of the war. Speed was everything. An enemy that was given time to consolidate a position was an enemy that would cost far more blood to dislodge. Better to press hard, accept risk, keep opponents off balance, and reacting rather than acting. These instincts served him well in conventional military terms, and they would be refined over the following years into something approaching genuine tactical mastery in the mobile warfare that he clearly loved. But speed also meant improvisation, and improvisation in an ideologically poisoned command environment meant that the space between military action and criminal action could collapse very quickly when the pressure was on. His decorations accumulated. His name circulated more widely among the SS hierarchy. Men who would later serve under him in Normandy were, in some cases, already forming their understanding of what Meyer expected and what kind of conduct would be rewarded in his orbit. The culture of a military formation is shaped from the top, through small signals and large ones. What gets praised? What gets overlooked? What gets punished? The Hitlerjugend division that Meyer would eventually command had not yet been formed, but the values that would characterize it were already being established through the careers and decisions of officers like him. There is a difficult thing to articulate about soldiers who demonstrate genuine courage and tactical ability in the service of a fundamentally criminal enterprise. Military historians sometimes struggle with how to hold both truths simultaneously. that a man might be skilled and brave in a narrow professional sense, while also being complicit in atrocity through the structures he served and advanced. Meyer's early career in Poland and the East is precisely this kind of uncomfortable complexity. His boldness under fire was real, his tactical instincts were real, and the system those qualities were serving was engaged, at the same moment, in mass murder carried out with bureaucratic efficiency. The gap between military professionalism and criminal orders was not closing during this period of Meyer's career. If anything, it was widening, because the ambitions of the regime were expanding and the machinery of violence was growing more sophisticated. Meyer was rising within that machinery, accumulating authority and reputation, building the network of loyal subordinates and admiring superiors that would define his later years. Poland had been a rehearsal for German arms broadly, and for Meyer specifically. The lessons he drew from it were military ones: the value of speed, the power of initiative, the importance of keeping forward momentum. What he did not appear to draw from it were the lessons that might have mattered more, about where the path he was walking ultimately led, and who would be waiting at the end of it to hold him accountable. By the time the Eastern campaigns wound through their early phases, and German attention began shifting toward Western Europe and the Mediterranean, Meyer had established himself as something the SS genuinely valued: a combat officer whose men would follow him into situations where survival was genuinely uncertain, and who could deliver results under fire. That reputation was about to carry him further west and further up the chain of command, toward the experiences in Greece and the Balkans that would sharpen him still further, and toward the appointment that would place him at the center of one of the most consequential and criminal episodes of the entire war. By the spring of 1941, Kurt Meyer had already accumulated more combat experience than most officers twice his age. Poland had been a brief and brutal education in the speed of modern war. The early Eastern skirmishes had added weight to his tactical instincts, but the campaigns that would cement his battlefield identity, the ones that would transform him from a capable SS officer into a figure genuinely feared and admired within the German military establishment, were still ahead of him. They would come not from the frozen steppes or the industrial heartland, but from the ancient mountains and sun-bleached roads of southeastern Europe. The Balkans and Greece would be his proving ground, and in the ruins of old empires, a new kind of soldier would take more definite shape. Germany's turn toward the Balkans in 1941 was not originally part of the plan. Hitler's strategic vision had been fixed on the Soviet Union, the great ideological war that would determine the fate of the Reich for generations. But events in Yugoslavia and Greece forced Berlin's hand. When a coup in Belgrade overturned a government that had aligned itself with the Axis, Hitler ordered the destruction of Yugoslavia with a rage that was as personal as it was political. Simultaneously, Italian military failures in Greece had created a dangerous flank that threatened the entire Mediterranean position. German intervention became unavoidable, and with it came the rapid redeployment of some of the Wehrmacht's most capable formations. Among them was the division in which Meyer served, moving south and west in a matter of days, absorbing the logistical shock and pressing toward a new theater entirely. The campaign in Yugoslavia opened in April of 1941 and lasted barely 2 weeks in any conventional sense. What it lacked in duration, it compensated for in intensity. Meyer's unit was among those pushing through terrain that confounded the mechanized doctrine he had been trained to execute. Mountain passes, narrow gorges, roads barely wide enough for a single armored vehicle. These were not the broad plains where the Panzer Arm had stunned Europe. Here, commanders had to improvise constantly, reading the ground with their own eyes, rather than relying on clean aerial maps and radio traffic from reconnaissance units. Meyer thrived in precisely this kind of environment. He had a talent, already becoming well known among his peers, for moving faster than the situation seemed to permit. He pushed columns forward when caution would have called for a pause. He accepted risk as a professional obligation rather than a personal failing. There is a particular quality in a commander who refuses to be slowed by uncertainty, and in 1941, that quality was in high demand. The Yugoslav campaign was officially swift, but the conditions on the ground told a messier story. Resistance varied enormously from sector to sector. In some areas, organized military units collapsed on contact. In others, determined defenders used the geography to extract a real cost from the advancing Germans. Meyer's handling of his reconnaissance elements during this phase drew repeated notice from his superiors. He had developed an understanding of how to use advanced units, not merely as eyes, but as weapons in themselves, probing aggressively, fixing defenders in place, and creating opportunities for harder-hitting forces to exploit the confusion that followed. It was a method he would refine over the coming years, until it became something close to a personal signature. Greece came next, and it was a different kind of experience altogether. The Greek army and the British forces that had been committed in support of them were not broken opponents. They fought with genuine determination, and the terrain of northern Greece, the mountain chains and river valleys running roughly east to west, made every kilometer of advance costly in time and effort, even when it was not especially costly in men. The German offensive moved south with considerable force, and Meyer's unit was again in the thick of the fighting. What he encountered was an opponent that understood the land and was willing to use it, retreating in good order towards successive defensive lines, rather than breaking under the initial shock of contact. This required patience from the German commanders, a quality not always associated with the SS style of warfare, and yet Meyer demonstrated it when the situation demanded. The Corinth Canal crossing was among the more dramatic operations of the Greek campaign, a moment when German airborne forces attempted to seize the vital choke point before retreating British and Commonwealth troops could use it as an obstacle. The operation was complicated, and the outcome was mixed. What it illustrated, beyond its immediate tactical significance, was the kind of joint and improvised warfare that the Balkans campaign repeatedly demanded. Meyer was not part of the airborne element, but his unit was among those moving rapidly to consolidate gains and pursue retreating Allied forces south toward the Peloponnese. The pace was relentless by design. German operational thinking during this period was built on the premise that momentum, once achieved, must never be voluntarily surrendered. Meyer had absorbed this completely. He received decorations during this period. The German military establishment was not reluctant to recognize battlefield performance, and Meyer's combination of aggressive tactics and a genuine ability to inspire men under fire was the kind of leadership the SS senior command wanted made visible to the wider force. Recognition mattered institutionally because it reinforced the culture. It told younger officers and soldiers what kind of behavior was expected and rewarded. For Meyer personally, decoration was not simply a matter of ego, though it would be naive to pretend ambition played no role. It also carried practical weight in the fiercely competitive hierarchy of the SS, where reputation could open doors that formal rank alone could not. Every medal was a credential. Every citation was a step forward in a world where advancement depended on being seen and remembered. Away from the immediate fighting, the Balkans presented a grimmer picture. German and Italian occupation policies in Yugoslavia were brutal from the beginning. The partition of the country, the installation of collaborationist governments, and the systematic persecution of Serb, Jewish, and Roma populations, created conditions of extraordinary suffering almost immediately after the fighting ended. Meyer's role in these occupation policies was that of a combat officer rather than an administrator, and the documentary record of his specific involvement in occupation atrocities during this period is less direct than what would emerge in Normandy 3 years later. But the machinery was visible to anyone who served in the region. The camps, the reprisals, the summary executions in villages, these were not hidden from the German officer corps. They were part of the operational environment, and accommodating them required a choice, conscious or otherwise, to look in a particular direction and not in another. Greece itself settled into a grim occupation after the fighting concluded. Athens fell in late April of 1941, and the swastika was raised above the Acropolis in one of the more photographed moments of the entire war. The symbolism was deliberate and heavy, an ancient civilization under the boot of a regime that claimed the inheritance of classical Europe while systematically destroying its principles. Meyer moved through this environment as a soldier passing through a landscape already being reshaped by forces that went well beyond the battlefield. He did not linger in Greece as an occupation figure. His trajectory continued to point east and north, toward the larger campaigns being organized for the Soviet Union and the grinding attritional warfare that would come to define the war's central axis. But the Balkans left marks on him that went beyond the decorations on his chest. The speed of the Balkan campaigns had reinforced a particular lesson that Meyer would carry forward, that audacity, properly applied, could compensate for numerical or materiality. The German forces that overran Yugoslavia and Greece were not always larger than the forces opposing them. They were often faster, better coordinated, and more willing to accept tactical risk in pursuit of operational advantage. Meyer had internalized this, not as an abstract doctrine, but as a personal philosophy of command. You moved before the enemy expected movement. You attacked when defense seemed logical. You kept your opponent responding to you rather than the reverse. These were the principles that would make him one of the most tactically capable SS Panzer commanders of the later war. They were also the principles that would make him dangerous in a different sense entirely, one that had nothing to do with tanks or terrain. The months in the Balkans and Greece also deepened Meyer's relationship with the men who served under him. SS culture placed enormous emphasis on the bond between a commander and his soldiers, and Meyer had a genuine talent for cultivating that bond. He was not a distant figure who issued orders from a protected command post. He led from the front, sometimes to the point of recklessness, and his men knew it. They had seen him in exposed positions where no officer of his rank was required to be. That visibility created a loyalty that went beyond the formal structures of military obedience. It created the kind of personal devotion that could, in certain circumstances, lead men to act on what they believed their commander wanted, rather than on what formal orders required. In a properly functioning military, with clear legal and ethical frameworks, such loyalty might simply be the foundation of a cohesive unit. In the SS, it would become something considerably more volatile. By the time the Balkan campaigns concluded and German attention pivoted definitively toward Operation Barbarossa, Meyer had consolidated his standing within the SS military hierarchy in a way that would have seemed improbable even a few years earlier. He was not yet the figure whose name would appear in the dispatches of Allied intelligence or the testimonies of Canadian survivors. That chapter was still years away, but the man who would eventually command the Hitler-Jugend division in Normandy was already taking his final shape in the mountains of Yugoslavia and the sun-burned roads south of Athens. Every campaign had added a layer. Every decoration had reinforced the identity he was building. The question that history would eventually ask about Kurt Meyer was not whether he was capable. The record on that point was already beyond dispute. The question was what that capability had been made to serve, and where exactly the boundary between a soldier and something worse had been crossed, or whether, in the world he inhabited, such a boundary had ever truly existed at all. By the time Kurt Meyer returned from the Balkans, he was no longer simply a promising officer. He was a known quantity, a name that circulated through SS command structures with a particular kind of reverence. The campaigns in Greece and Yugoslavia had done something to his reputation that no amount of peacetime drilling could have manufactured. They had given him the texture of a survivor, a man who made decisions under pressure and came out the other side intact, decorated, and hungry for more. The SS leadership, always alert to men who combined reckless aggression with tactical coherence, watched his ascent with quiet satisfaction. In an organization that rewarded audacity above almost every other virtue, Meyer had proven himself an ideal specimen. He was the kind of officer who made the institution look like it worked, and he would be given every opportunity to prove it again. His promotions during this period came with a rhythm that spoke to institutional confidence rather than routine advancement. Each new rank carried with it a broader command authority, a larger formation to shape and direct. The SS Panzer Arm was expanding rapidly during these years, drawing on the lessons of armored warfare absorbed from France and the Eastern Front, and translating them into doctrine for elite formations. Meyer absorbed those lessons with unusual speed. He understood the armored breakthrough not merely as a technique, but as a philosophy. The idea that momentum itself was a weapon, that the side which hesitated had already lost half the battle before a single round was fired. His peers noticed, his superiors noticed, and increasingly, so did the younger men beneath him. For the junior officers of the Waffen-SS, still forming their professional identities, Meyer had become something close to a model. What made him compelling to those younger men was not simply his decorations, though the awards on his chest were by now considerable. It was the way he carried himself in the field, the forward position, the refusal to command from a distance, the physical presence at the point of contact that seemed to defy the normal calculus of risk for an officer of his seniority. He had an instinct for reading ground that experienced soldiers sometimes called feel, a near-intuitive grasp of where the line of vulnerability lay in an enemy position and how to press it before it could be reinforced. This was not recklessness in any simple sense. It was a calculated and practiced style, honed over years of combat on multiple fronts. But it looked like recklessness to those who observed it without the full context. And that image, the commander who went where lesser men would not, was precisely the image the SS wanted its officers to project. The Eastern Front had sharpened this reputation considerably. The fighting in the Soviet Union was of a scale and brutality that dwarfed anything Meyer had encountered in Poland or the Balkans. Vast distances, collapsing logistics, an enemy that absorbed punishment that would have shattered any Western army and kept fighting. These conditions tested officers in ways that earlier campaigns had not. Meyer operated within this environment and emerged from it not merely credentialed but transformed. His handling of reconnaissance elements, his ability to coordinate infantry and armor under fluid and chaotic conditions, earned him recognition that extended beyond his own unit. He was being discussed at levels of command well above his immediate formation. Men like Meyer were identified as force multipliers, officers whose presence in a sector could change the texture of the fighting around them. It would be a mistake, however, to view his rise purely through the lens of battlefield competence. The SS was not simply a military organization. It was a political instrument wearing military uniform, and advancement within it required a particular ideological alignment as much as tactical skill. Meyer had absorbed the party's worldview deeply and early. His conduct toward civilians and prisoners in the East had not been characterized by restraint. The same forward aggression that his superiors praised in tactical contexts expressed itself in other ways when the fighting moved through occupied territory. These dimensions of his conduct were not incidental to his career. They were continuous with it. The institution he served evaluated both registers of behavior and found him acceptable across both. That acceptance was itself a kind of promotion, a signal that the full scope of his conduct had been seen and endorsed. By the middle years of the war, Meyer was operating in command environments where the division between military professionalism and ideological function had become almost theoretical. The formations he led were not conventional armies in any meaningful sense. They were instruments of a specific project, trained to fight with extraordinary effectiveness, and indoctrinated to regard the war as a racial and civilizational struggle, rather than a contest between nation-states. This framing did not make them worse soldiers in any technical sense. In certain respects, it made them more dangerous. Men willing to accept conditions and engage in actions that would have broken units operating under conventional military ethics. Meyer was both a product of this system and an active architect of it within his sphere of command. His mastery of mobile warfare tactics during this period drew on a particular synthesis. He studied the successes of the German armored campaigns with analytical care, extracting principles rather than simply imitating procedures. He understood that the tank was not a weapon of attrition, but of disruption, that its value lay not in trading blows, but in generating the kind of disorientation in an enemy's rear that made coherent resistance impossible. He drilled his subordinates on reaction speed, on communication under stress, on the kind of decentralized initiative that allowed junior commanders to exploit opportunities before they closed. These were genuinely sophisticated military ideas, and his ability to articulate them to younger officers who had grown up reading about blitzkrieg but had not yet practiced it gave him an authority that went beyond rank. Among the junior officers of the SS Panzer formations, his reputation had acquired an almost legendary quality. Stories about his conduct in earlier campaigns circulated through mess rooms and training grounds. The moment he had pressed forward, when withdrawal seemed inevitable, the instinct that had saved a flanked unit from destruction, the physical courage that manifested not as indifference to danger, but as a kind of calculated defiance of it. Some of these stories were almost surely embellished in the retelling. That embellishment was itself significant. It told you something about what these men wanted from a commander and what values they were organizing their professional identities around. Meyer embodied those values almost perfectly, and he knew it. He was not unaware of his own mythology. This self-awareness shaped how he led. He understood that his presence carried symbolic weight, that the way he appeared to his men, the tone he struck, the risks he visibly accepted, the indifference he projected toward hardship, was itself a form of command. He managed that image with care. There was a theatricality to Meyer's leadership style, a deliberate quality to his public persona within the institution that sat alongside the genuine tactical gifts. He was not performing courage he did not possess, but he was performing it consciously, calibrating the performance for maximum effect on the men watching him. In an organization that ran on a kind of martial mythology, this was sophisticated institutional behavior. It was also, in a different register, a form of manipulation. By the time the German position in the east had begun its long, grinding retreat, and attention shifted toward preparing defensive operations in the west, Meyer was among the senior SS commanders, being considered for significant new commands. The SS Panzer divisions were being restructured and reinforced. New formations were being created from the most ideologically saturated recruiting pool the Third Reich possessed, and experienced commanders were needed to transform raw material into effective fighting units. Meyer's combination of combat experience, ideological reliability, and the capacity to inspire younger soldiers made him an obvious candidate for exactly this kind of role. The institution had been preparing him for it, knowingly or not, since the early days of his military training. He had risen through its structure with a consistency that reflected both his own abilities and the coherence of the system that had shaped him. What the record shows, across these years of promotion and consolidation, is a man in full alignment with the institution he served. His ambitions and the institution's ambitions ran in parallel. He wanted command, and the SS wanted commanders of his type. He wanted to be seen as the ideal of SS military excellence, and the institution wanted exactly such figures to serve as models for the next generation of soldiers it was producing. This convergence would have its consequences. The formation that he was about to help build, the 12th SS Panzer Division, drawn from Hitler Youth members who had known nothing but National Socialism from their earliest years, would bear the imprint of that convergence in every aspect of its character. Meyer's ambition and the regime's project had become, by this point, effectively indistinguishable, and a new chapter of the war was about to give them both a theatre in which to find their fullest expression. By the spring of 1943, the war had begun to turn. The catastrophe at Stalingrad had consumed an entire German army, and the men who ran the Reich understood, even if they could not say it openly, that the easy victories were finished. What remained was the question of how to fight a war that was growing longer, wider, and more costly than any of them had planned for. The answer for Heinrich Himmler and the leadership of the Waffen-SS was not to slow down. It was to reach deeper, into the schools, into the youth leagues, into the very generation of boys who had been raised from childhood on a diet of flags, marching songs, and the promise that their lives belonged to something greater than themselves. Out of that logic, one of the most troubling military formations of the entire war was born. The division that would become the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend did not emerge from military necessity alone. It emerged from ideology, wearing the costume of military necessity. For years, the Hitler Youth had been the single most powerful instrument for shaping young German minds, enrolling millions of boys and girls into an organization that blurred the line between childhood and paramilitary service. By the time those boys were old enough to carry a rifle, many of them had already spent the better part of a decade being told that sacrifice was glory, that obedience was virtue, and that the enemy, whoever the regime named as the enemy, deserved no mercy. When Himmler authorized the formation of a new armored division drawing primarily from the ranks of these young men, he was not simply creating a fighting force. He was completing a process that had started in classrooms and sports grounds years before the first tank engine ever turned over. The recruitment drive began in earnest in the early months of 1943. Most of the young men who answered the call were born in 1926, which meant they were 17 years old when they received their papers. They had been 4 or 5 years old when Hitler came to power. They had no conscious memory of Weimar Germany, no frame of reference for any political system other than the one they had grown up inside. They had been formed by a world that presented National Socialism not as a choice, but as a natural condition, like weather or gravity. When they lined up to volunteer, and the word volunteer carries complicated weight here, they were doing what their entire upbringing had trained them to regard as the highest possible expression of who they were. Tens of thousands responded, and from those tens of thousands, the division began to take shape. The older officers assigned to train and lead this formation faced a challenge unlike any in conventional military experience. They were handed young men of extraordinary physical fitness and near absolute ideological certainty, but with no combat experience and, in many cases, a dangerously incomplete understanding of fear. Veterans understood fear. They had learned in Poland, in France, in the Balkans, and above all on the Eastern Front, that the battlefield does not care about conviction. It cares about fire discipline, about cover, about the ability to suppress panic and think clearly under sustained pressure, transforming teenagers who believed themselves invincible into soldiers who could survive was as much a work of careful unlearning as it was of training, and not every officer in the division was committed to that unlearning. Some of them saw the boys' fanaticism not as a liability to be managed, but as a resource to be exploited. Kurt Meyer's role in the formation of the division placed him at the center of these tensions. By this stage of the war, Meyer had accumulated more frontline command experience than most officers half a generation older than him. He had operated in multiple theaters, had shown a consistent talent for aggressive mobile tactics, and had built around himself a personal reputation that younger SS men treated almost as mythology. His manner was direct, physical, contemptuous of caution, and magnetic in the way that certain commanders become magnetic, not through warmth, but through the absolute projection of certainty. When he walked through a training area, the boys noticed. When he spoke, they listened, the way young men listen to someone who makes them feel that he already knows the outcome and is simply waiting for them to catch up. He was, for the Hitlerjugend division, both a tactical asset and an ideological amplifier. The training sites spread across occupied France and the Low Countries, where the division assembled and began the long work of converting raw recruits into armored infantry and panzer crews. The scale of the undertaking was substantial. Building an armored division from the ground up required not just men but equipment, tanks, half-tracks, artillery pieces, signals apparatus, maintenance personnel, fuel logistics, field medical capacity. Germany in 1943 was not rich in any of these things. The Eastern Front consumed materiel at a rate that left formations in the West perpetually short. And yet the Hitlerjugend division received priority attention from SS supply channels, reflecting how seriously Himmler regarded this particular formation as a statement of the SS's ongoing military ambitions. The boys would not go to war poorly equipped, even if older formations were scraping together their last reserves. Inside the training regimen, two things happened simultaneously, and the interplay between them would define what the division became. On one level, the young soldiers were taught real military skills, how to operate in combined arms formations, how to use terrain, how to coordinate infantry movement with armored support, how to read a tactical situation under fire and respond with something other than raw aggression. These were genuine competencies, taught by genuine professionals, and the division's later battlefield performance, however morally contaminated, reflected real military capability. But alongside this professional instruction ran a parallel curriculum that was never written on any training schedule. It ran through speeches and ceremonies, through the music played at evening assembly, through the language officers used when they described the enemy. It ran through the deep structure of daily life in the division, where questioning was never welcome, and where the identity of the unit was fused with the identity of the ideology that had created it. The question of prisoner handling was not addressed the way it would have been in a conventional military formation. Across the broader Waffen-SS, a culture had developed, reinforced over years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front, in which the normal protections accorded to captured enemy soldiers were treated as inconveniences at best and as signs of weakness at worst. The laws of war existed in the training manuals, but they competed for space in young minds, with years of propaganda that had systematically dehumanized enemy soldiers, particularly Soviet soldiers, but extending, with sufficient ideological encouragement, to anyone the regime labeled a racial or political adversary. For teenage soldiers who had absorbed this framing since childhood, the gap between taking a prisoner and refusing to take one was not always as wide as the Geneva Convention required it to be, and the officers who trained them understood this. Some of them were counting on it. By the autumn of 1943, the division had begun to coalesce into something resembling a coherent fighting formation. Inspections took place, equipment arrived, live fire exercises produced the kind of coordination between armor and infantry that staff officers noted with satisfaction. On paper, and increasingly in practice, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was becoming one of the more capable armored formations Germany would field in the West. Visiting senior officers came away impressed. The boys were fit, disciplined in the military sense, eager to prove themselves, and commanded by officers with genuine front experience. What those visiting officers chose not to scrutinize too carefully was the specific texture of what that eagerness meant and what had built it. Meyer continued to shape the division's character through his own example and through the culture he reinforced around him. He did not need to issue explicit instructions about every aspect of behavior. Command culture does not work that way, and experienced commanders know it. The tone a senior officer sets, what he rewards, what he ignores, what he visibly admires, radiates downward through every rank. When Meyer displayed contempt for hesitation, when he celebrated aggression, when he treated the war as a test of will between men of iron and enemies deserving of that iron's full application, the officers beneath him absorbed those signals and passed them further down. The youngest soldiers in the division learned not just from their training schedules, but from the entire human environment they inhabited, and that environment carried Meyer's imprint in ways that would not become fully visible until the summer of the following year. The formation of the Hitlerjugend division was, in the most literal sense, the completion of a project that the Nazi state had been running for more than a decade. Every parade, every camp, every evening of songs around a fire, every classroom lesson about destiny and sacrifice had been a preparatory step toward exactly this. Young men in uniform, in tanks, on the road, toward an enemy that their entire upbringing had taught them to regard not as a soldier to be fought, but as an obstacle to be destroyed. The military professionals among their officers knew how to use them. The ideologues among their officers knew how to inflame them. And in men like Meyer, those two roles had never been cleanly separated. What emerged from the training grounds of occupied France was not simply a division. It was the physical embodiment of everything the Third Reich believed about itself: powerful, fanatical, technically formidable, and carrying within its structure a capacity for violence against the helpless that would write some of the darkest pages in the history of the war in the West. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend represented something unprecedented in military history. It was not merely a unit of soldiers formed from young men conscripted through conventional means. Rather, it was the manifestation of 2 decades of systematic ideological conditioning distilled into a single formation of panzer troops. The men who would fill its ranks had grown up in Hitler's Germany from childhood, breathing the air of Nazi ideology before they could comprehend politics or question authority. They had marched in Hitler youth parades, attended indoctrination camps, learned to hate designated enemies as children learned to recognize their own families, and accepted the racial mythology of the regime as fundamental truth. When these young men entered the 12th SS, they arrived not as recruits requiring basic political education, but as true believers already forged in the furnace of Nazi youth organization. Their commanders, including Kurt Meyer, inherited soldiers whose psychological foundation had been laid years before they ever touched a rifle. Meyer understood this reality with crystalline clarity. As he rose to prominence within the division's command structure in 1943, he recognized that the conventional military approach of drilling discipline and tactical proficiency would suffice for ordinary units. But the Hitlerjugend demanded something different. These were boys, some barely 18 years old, many 16 or 17, pulled directly from the Hitler Youth leadership cadre. They had never worked under a democratic system, never heard dissenting opinions from trusted authority figures, and their entire moral framework had been constructed within the parameters of Nazi racial ideology. Instead of viewing this as a problem requiring corrective measures, Meyer and his fellow commanders saw it as an advantage. They possessed soldiers whose fanaticism ran deeper than normal military enthusiasm, whose loyalty was rooted not in patriotism alone, but in the deepest psychological conditioning. The challenge, from their perspective, was to channel this fanaticism toward military effectiveness rather than suppress it. The training regimen that emerged combined conventional panzer warfare instruction with explicit ideological reinforcement. The daily routine began before dawn. Young soldiers dressed in darkness performed physical training in harsh conditions and endured grueling exercises designed to test endurance and obedience. Lectures on panzer tactics, gunnery principles, and vehicle maintenance filled the morning hours, but interspersed throughout were sessions dedicated to reinforcing Nazi ideology and racial doctrine. Officers delivered speeches on the Jewish question, the danger of Bolshevism, and the historical mission of the Germanic people. These were not presented as propaganda to be questioned or debated, but as fundamental truths around which military excellence must be constructed. A soldier could not be tactically proficient while harboring doubt about the righteousness of Nazi racial policy. The two had to work together, reinforcing each other, creating soldiers whose military competence and ideological commitment were fused into a single identity. Meyer himself embodied this fusion. He was not merely a panzer commander who happened to be an SS officer. He was a true believer in SS ideology who happened to be a skilled military tactician. When he addressed the troops, he spoke with the authority of both a decorated commander and a convinced ideologue. The men respected him, not despite his fanaticism, but because of it. In their worldview, shaped by years of Hitler Youth training, a commander who questioned Nazi racial doctrine would have seemed weak and uncertain. A commander like Meyer, who could articulate both advanced panzer tactics and absolute conviction in Nazi ideology, appeared transcendent. He represented the fusion they had been trained to pursue. The young soldiers of the Hitlerjugend wanted to serve under men like Meyer because such men vindicated everything their Hitler Youth leaders had taught them about sacrifice, duty, and the superiority of will over material circumstance. The physical training regressed any remaining sense of independent moral judgment. Sleep deprivation was systematic and deliberate. Soldiers trained in exhaustion, when rational thought becomes difficult and emotional responses dominate. In such a state, the ideological reinforcement became more effective. A well-rested soldier might question a statement about racial supremacy. An exhausted 17-year-old, subjected to the same claim, would accept it with minimal cognitive resistance. Weapons training was conducted with obsessive intensity. The recruits learned to handle anti-tank rifles, machine guns, and explosives with mechanical precision. But this technical proficiency was never separated from its ideological purpose. Weapons training was presented not as neutral military skill, but as preparation for a sacred struggle against Germany's existential enemies. When a young soldier learned to fire a machine gun, he was being prepared for combat against forces portrayed as subhuman threats to the racial community. One element of the training proved particularly significant: the cultivation of unit cohesion. The Hitlerjugend division recruited heavily from the Hitler Youth leadership apparatus, meaning many of these soldiers already knew each other. They had attended the same camps, marched in the same parades, and absorbed the same ideological instruction for years. The military training deliberately strengthened these bonds. Soldiers were organized into small groups that trained together, ate together, slept together, and endured hardship together. This created intense loyalty, not just to the Nazi regime, but to their immediate comrades. A soldier might hesitate to disobey a direct order if doing so meant betraying his fellow soldiers. Unit pride became indistinguishable from ideological commitment. The division cultivated the narrative that the Hitlerjugend represented the future of the German people, the embodiment of the new man that Nazi ideology had been constructing for years. Young soldiers absorbed the message that serving in this division was not merely military service, but participation in historical destiny. Meyer and the other senior commanders were explicit about their goals. In training sessions and officers' meetings, they articulated the philosophy that conventional military discipline alone could not sustain soldiers through the trials ahead. The war, as they understood it, was not a conventional conflict between nations, but an existential struggle between races and ideologies. Soldiers would face temptations to surrender, to show mercy to enemies designated as subhuman, to question orders that seemed excessive. Only soldiers whose ideological conviction ran as deep as their military training could be trusted to remain steadfast. The Hitlerjugend division was being constructed as an instrument of not just military force, but of ideological will. The training, from this perspective, was not propaganda layered onto military instruction. It was essential preparation for the kind of warfare the division's commanders intended to wage. The spiritual element of the training deserves attention. While the Nazi regime was officially secular, its ideology possessed quasi-religious dimensions. Meyer and others explicitly drew parallels between Nazi struggle and religious sacrifice. Young soldiers were encouraged to view death in service of the Nazi state as a form of immortality. Their sacrifice would be remembered and honored. Their names would live on in the racial community they had fought to preserve. This provided psychological comfort to teenagers contemplating their own mortality. The division issued inspirational materials and conducted ceremonies designed to reinforce this sense of sacred purpose. At night, soldiers gathered around campfires for singing and informal indoctrination sessions. The atmosphere resembled religious revival meetings more than conventional military training. Young soldiers sang songs that merged military vigor with Nazi ideological content, their voices rising together in darkness, their sense of collective purpose intensifying with each verse. The training also incorporated deliberate moral disorientation. Soldiers were subjected to scenarios designed to normalize orders they would have instinctively resisted before entering the military. In training exercises, prisoners were mentioned and then disappeared. The soldiers were expected to move forward without inquiry or concern. Subordinates who questioned orders from superiors were publicly humiliated during training scenarios. Young soldiers learned through example that obedience to the chain of command was more important than moral judgment. The training was not usually explicit on this point. The lessons were conveyed through practice and through the observation of how superior officers responded to various situations. Gradually, across hundreds of small moments and interactions, the young soldiers' capacity for independent moral judgment was eroded. They learned to compartmentalize, to focus on immediate tactical problems, while accepting the larger framework within which those problems existed. Food and material conditions during training were deliberately harsh. Soldiers received minimal rations, inadequate clothing, and little comfort. This hardship served multiple purposes. It tested physical endurance and weeded out those lacking sufficient willpower. But it also served psychological functions. Hardship creates cohesion among groups that endure it together. The soldiers credited their survival of harsh training to their superior willpower and superior racial character. They contrasted their toughness with their assumptions about the softness of democratic Western soldiers. This hardship also deepened their sense of sacrifice and commitment. Having suffered in training, they had already demonstrated their willingness to accept privation for the cause. The transition to combat, when it came, would seem almost a natural progression from what they had already endured. Meyer's personal involvement in this training regimen was not peripheral. He appeared regularly to address the troops, speaking to them about tactics and ideology in equal measure. His presence reinforced the message that military excellence and ideological commitment were not separate paths, but two aspects of a single pursuit. The young soldiers observed his bearing, his confidence, his apparent conviction. They had no way to know whether his ideology was genuine or performed, nor would that distinction have mattered to them. What mattered was that a highly decorated officer, a man admired for his battlefield prowess, embodied the merger of tactical skill and ideological conviction toward which they were being trained. They wanted to become like Meyer, which meant absorbing not just his tactical innovations, but his ideological worldview. By the time the division completed its initial training phase in late 1943 and early 1944, the fusion of military and ideological indoctrination had become nearly complete. These soldiers possessed genuine panzer warfare capabilities. They could service vehicles, operate complex weapons systems, coordinate small unit movements, and execute tactical maneuvers with increasing precision. Simultaneously, their ideological conviction had deepened. They possessed unshakable faith in Nazi racial doctrine, absolute loyalty to the chain of command, and psychological preparation for warfare against enemies designated as subhuman. This combination was dangerous, beyond the conventional military sense. Soldiers of high technical competence and moderate ideological conviction can be controlled and directed within certain boundaries, but soldiers of high technical competence and absolute ideological conviction represent something different. They have the capability to execute complex operations and the psychological conviction that such operations are morally justified, regardless of conventional ethical constraints. The training had accomplished what its designers intended. The Hitlerjugend had become precisely what the Nazi state required. Teenage boys transformed into soldiers who possessed both the means and the psychological disposition to commit atrocity in service of ideology. The final weeks of training before the division's deployment to France involved a subtle shift in emphasis. The grand strategic narratives and ideological lectures remained present, but increasingly, the focus narrowed onto preparation for specific combat scenarios. Intelligence arrived regarding anticipated Allied operations. Training exercises began to simulate conflicts with Canadian and British forces. Officers delivered tactical briefings on expected enemy equipment and tactics. Yet even in these practical sessions, the ideological framework remained embedded. Canadians and British soldiers were presented not as professional adversaries to be respected, but as servants of plutocratic powers opposing Germany's righteous struggle. Any atrocity committed against such enemies was contextualized as justified response to the existential threat they represented. The young soldiers were not told explicitly to murder prisoners or abuse wounded enemies, but through thousands of subtle messages woven into training, They had absorbed the conviction that such acts would be justified if circumstances demanded them. They had been prepared not just as soldiers but as ideological instruments. What would happen in the Bocage near Caen in the coming summer would not represent a failure of their training, but rather its tragic fulfillment. By the autumn of 1943, Kurt Meyer stood at a threshold. The Hitler-Jugend Division had been formally constituted only months earlier, yet already the machinery of indoctrination and military training had consumed the lives of thousands of teenagers, conscripted from the Hitler Youth apparatus. Meyer, now holding the rank of Sturmbannführer, had proven himself adept at transforming ideological fervor into tactical competence. But theory and preparation, no matter how rigorous, could only carry a commander so far. What awaited was the crucible of actual warfare, and the Reich, despite its propaganda of inevitable triumph, faced an enemy increasingly capable and increasingly near. In the autumn of 1943, the strategic situation for Nazi Germany had shifted decisively. The Soviet Union, having survived Barbarossa and inflicted catastrophic defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, was pressing westward with relentless momentum. The Allies had begun consolidating their foothold in Sicily and would soon cross into mainland Italy. North Africa had been lost. The strategic bombing offensive against German industry was intensifying, draining resources and attention from all quarters. For Hitler and his circle, the year that once promised final victory had become the year of anxiety. It was in this atmosphere of creeping desperation that the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend received orders to relocate from its training grounds in Poland. In December 1943, the division began its long journey westward by rail and motor transport, destination Belgium and northern France. Meyer, recognized for his tactical flair and his absolute commitment to SS ideology, was assigned as commander of the division's main panzer regiment, placing him effectively as second in command of the entire division under Brigadeführer Fritz Witt. The move represented both promotion and burden. The division would be stationed in the areas most likely to face Allied invasion, particularly in the region around Kunks and along the Norman coast. The proximity to potential invasion zones was not accidental. German strategic planning, desperate and reactive as it had become, anticipated that any major Allied cross-channel operation would face the formidable resistance of panzer forces held in reserve. The Hitler-Jugend Division, with its fearsome reputation for ideological commitment and its modern tank strength, was positioned as one of the Reich's most important cards to play in what senior commanders increasingly suspected would be a desperate defensive struggle. The winter of 1943 turned to 1944, and Meyer oversaw the final establishment of the division's cantonment across Belgium and into the Normandy region. Hundreds of trucks, tanks, and support vehicles had to be positioned strategically to enable rapid deployment once the invasion signal came. Mechanized transport was dispersed across multiple locations to avoid concentrated vulnerability to air attack. Ammunition and fuel dumps were established in concealed positions. Repair facilities were organized. Meyer moved among the various battalion positions, inspecting equipment, assessing the readiness of his officers, and conducting tactical exercises designed to hone coordination between tanks and supporting infantry elements. The world of northern France in winter was cold and wet, far different from the training grounds the division had recently left. Soldiers who had never experienced anything but the indoctrination machinery of the Hitler Youth now faced the monotony and physical demands of operational readiness. Officers like Meyer worked to maintain morale, exploit the ideological fervor that had been carefully cultivated, and ensure that when the moment came, these teenager soldiers could function as a cohesive military force. Communication and coordination with other SS panzer formations in the region became increasingly important as winter progressed. Meyer attended conferences with commanders of comparable rank and seniority from other divisions. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, under the command of Sepp Dietrich, encompassed multiple divisions, and Meyer was part of this larger structure. There was competition for resources, for favorable positioning, for recognition within the SS hierarchy. Meyer, ambitious and capable, maneuvered skillfully within these political and military networks. He cultivated relationships with officers in the Wehrmacht regular army, many of whom viewed the SS with a mixture of respect for their fighting ability and disdain for their political fanaticism. Meyer, however, embodied a generation that did not see these as contradictions. For him, SS ideology and military professionalism were not in tension, but rather mutually reinforcing. The SS was simply the army, as it should be, purified of defeatism and weakness, welded into an instrument of superior warriors. As winter deepened and spring approached, the division conducted increasingly realistic exercises. Reconnaissance patrols ranged across the countryside, studying road networks, identifying defensive positions, and becoming familiar with the terrain they might soon have to defend or fight across. Tank crews conducted gunnery practice. Infantry training emphasized combined arms tactics, the coordination of panzer support with dismounted soldiers fighting on foot. Meyer participated directly in these training operations, demonstrating to subordinates that he demanded nothing of them that he was not willing to do himself. This personal leadership earned him respect among the officers and soldiers beneath him. Accounts from soldiers who served under Meyer consistently describe him as demanding but fair, aggressive but not recklessly so, dedicated to the fighting efficiency of his unit. Ideology surely motivated him, but he was also a professional soldier, concerned with the practical details that made the difference between victory and catastrophic defeat. The technological sophistication of the Hitler-Jugend division's equipment represented the state of German armor development in 1944. The division fielded Panther tanks, powerful and well-armed vehicles, with thick armor that made them formidable opponents. It also operated a significant number of Mark IV tanks, the workhorse of the German Panzer Arm, though increasingly outmatched by newer Allied designs. The division included dedicated tank destroyer units, armed with the fearsome Jagdpanther, a vehicle that combined the firepower of an 88mm gun with the mobility of a tracked chassis. Supporting the panzer elements were mechanized infantry, transported in half-tracked vehicles, equipped with machine guns and submachine guns. Artillery batteries provided mobile fire support. The division on paper was a formidable concentration of mobile firepower and combat strength. Yet it was also a division of teenagers, commanded by officers and non-commissioned officers, who had themselves grown up entirely within the Nazi system. None of them had known the pre-Hitler Germany. None of them had experienced any worldview except the one that had been relentlessly imposed upon them from childhood. This fact would prove consequential. Meyer's own worldview had evolved through a longer journey, though it had long since crystallized into absolute commitment to the Nazi regime and SS ideology. In the officers' messes and during staff conferences, Meyer moved among older Wehrmacht officers with an almost aggressive certainty. He believed in the racial and ideological doctrines of the SS. He believed that the war was an existential struggle against inferior civilizations that threatened Germanic civilization. He believed that whatever methods were necessary to achieve victory were morally justified. He had already participated in combat operations in Poland and the East, where such doctrines had manifested in horror. Those experiences had not troubled him. Instead, They had reinforced his conviction that he was part of a great historical necessity. As he prepared the Hitlerjugend division for what he sensed would be the critical test of his military career, Meyer carried with him not doubt, but absolute certainty of purpose. Intelligence regarding Allied intentions and capabilities grew more specific as spring 1944 approached. German reconnaissance aircraft, increasingly rare and vulnerable, reported activity in English ports and embarkation areas. Agents and informants provided fragmentary information about assault ship construction and the assembly of invasion fleets. High Command issued directives regarding the disposition of panzer forces and the anticipated response to invasion. The consensus among German commanders was that invasion would come, most likely across the Channel, into northern France. The great uncertainty was where precisely the blow would fall. Would it be in Normandy, or would the main assault come further east, around Pas-de-Calais, where the distance across the Channel was shortest? German strategic deception operations, which had been deceived in turn, believed that the main assault would come near Calais. This miscalculation would have profound consequences. For Meyer and the Hitlerjugend division, the implication was that they would likely receive early warning and rapid orders to move toward whatever beach sector the Allies chose. They would be among the first German mobile forces to engage the invasion fleet. By May 1944, the final preparations were complete. The division, numbering roughly 20,000 men and nearly 200 armored vehicles, was distributed across cantonment areas in Belgium and northeastern France. Meyer conducted final inspections and held meetings with his regimental commanders and battalion officers. Tensions among the soldiers were evident. They sensed that something momentous approached, though the exact timing remained classified. Some officers expressed confidence in German ability to repel the invasion. Others, more seasoned and realistic, harbored private doubts about facing the combined industrial and military might of the Allies. Meyer, in his interactions with subordinates, projected absolute confidence. The Hitlerjugend division was strong and well-trained. It would be deployed at the point of maximum impact. It would break the invasion on the beaches or in the bocage behind them. There was, from Meyer's perspective, no possibility of failure. Germany would prevail, or Germany would fall. There was no middle ground, no compromise possible. The final days of May 1944 brought an intensification of activity. Supply lines were verified once more. Fuel reserves were topped up. Medical units were restocked with bandages, morphine, and surgical supplies. Tank engines were run and inspected. Weapons were cleaned and tested. Officers gathered in the evenings to study maps and discuss contingencies. Weather reports were monitored obsessively. As late May turned toward the first days of June, an almost palpable electricity ran through the division. Everyone understood that within days, perhaps within hours, orders would arrive that would begin the most significant military operation of the war, as far as they were concerned. The men would be transported toward the coast. They would encounter an enemy that had proven capable and well-equipped. They would fire weapons at human beings and be fired upon in return. Some of them would not return. Meyer, reviewing maps and intelligence reports in his command post, contemplated this imminent collision without apparent anxiety. He had trained for this. He had planned for this. He believed in the righteousness of the cause. The only question remaining was whether the months of preparation, the ideological conditioning, the tactical training, and the military hardware would prove sufficient against what was coming. Yet Meyer could not have known the full scope of what approached. No German commander in 1944 possessed accurate intelligence about the true scale of the Allied invasion fleet. The number of landing craft, the total number of soldiers assembled, the depth of the logistical support behind the invasion, the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. the coordination of naval bombardment and air superiority that would accompany the assault. All of these facts remained hidden or underestimated. German strategic analysis continued to operate from assumptions of rough parity or German superiority. Intelligence officers reported on the assembly of invasion forces, but the information remained fragmentary and diffuse. Deception operations by the Allies, masterfully executed, reinforced German expectations that the main blow would fall elsewhere. Meyer and his peers knew an invasion was coming. They did not know it would be an operation of unprecedented scale, and that their division, despite its strength and training, would be committed piecemeal against an enemy that had overwhelming advantages in firepower, numbers, and logistical capacity. In early June 1944, as the Hitler-Jugend division stood at full readiness in its cantonment areas, Meyer contemplated the future with the confidence of a soldier who believed in his army, his cause, and his own abilities. Within days, that confidence would face its most severe test, and the decisions Meyer made in that crucible would define not only his military career, but establish his place in history as a commander whose unit perpetrated war crimes that would haunt him and mark him indelibly as a man culpable in the worst crimes of the Nazi regime. The morning of the 6th of June 1944 began as many others had in the occupied territories of northern France. German officers reviewed reports, soldiers cleaned weapons, supply trucks moved along roads between villages. Nothing in the routine suggested that the previous 4 years of static occupation were about to shatter into chaos. Yet across the Channel, in the darkness before dawn, thousands of ships cut through the waters between Britain and Normandy. Overhead, the sky itself filled with aircraft. More than 5,000 bombers and fighters gathered in the night air, moving toward the French coast like a storm front rolling across a darkening plain. On the ground, in camps and assembly areas scattered across southern England, men of the invasion force checked their equipment for the final time. Commanders studied maps and photographs of beaches they had seen only in intelligence briefings. The moment that Hitler's generals had feared for nearly 4 years was finally arriving, though most of them would not fully comprehend its magnitude until it was already too late. Kurt Meyer, at that early hour, was not in Normandy. He was stationed with the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend in the Flemish countryside east of Brussels, in Belgium, some 150 kilometers from the beaches where the Allies would land. The division occupied training areas that had been prepared and fortified over months. Equipment remained in orderly parks. Vehicles were maintained with the precision that SS discipline demanded. Meyer had spent the previous months driving his men hard, pushing them through exercises designed to test their reaction time and their ability to move rapidly across contested terrain. These young soldiers, most of them teenagers, who had known nothing but Nazi rule throughout their conscious lives, had been shaped in the ideological furnace since childhood. They were, in Meyer's assessment, the finest troops he had ever commanded. They obeyed orders without question. They fought with a fanaticism that bordered on the reckless. Whether this made them better soldiers or simply more dangerous ones remained an open question. The first indication that something significant was happening came through the radio networks that connected the German command structure. Messages began arriving in the early hours. Allied activity had been detected across the Channel. Naval bombardment was reported off the Normandy coast. Airborne landings were occurring inland. By dawn, it became clear that this was not a raid or a deception. This was invasion. German commanders, up and down the chain of command, had anticipated this moment, had prepared for it in theory, but the reality of it struck many of them with a kind of shock. The fortress that was supposed to be impenetrable, that Hitler had declared would break any attempt at invasion, was under assault. Within hours of the first contact, orders began flowing down to divisions positioned outside the immediate landing zones. Units were to move toward Normandy. The Hitler-Jugend division received its alert. Meyer began the process of mobilizing his men. The challenge that confronted Meyer and his peers that morning was not a simple one. German command authority over the response to invasion had been fragmented and disputed for months. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who was responsible for coastal defenses, believed that panzer reserves must be positioned close to the beaches so that invading forces could be thrown back into the sea before they could establish a beachhead. The High Command in Berlin, influenced by Hitler himself, preferred to keep panzer divisions in strategic reserve, positioned further back, to be committed only with explicit permission from the highest levels. This disagreement over doctrine, rooted in different theories of how the invasion would unfold and how it could be defeated, meant that no unified plan existed for immediate reaction. Instead, individual units received piecemeal orders as the day progressed. The Hitler-Jugend division was one of several SS panzer formations that would become tangled in this confusion. Meyer's immediate problem was not ideological or strategic. It was intensely practical. His division needed to move toward Normandy, covering a distance of 150 kilometers over roads that were increasingly threatened by Allied air power. The morning of the 6th of June brought clear skies over occupied France. That clarity, which would have been a blessing in normal circumstances, became a vulnerability. Within hours of the invasion starting, Allied fighter bombers began operating inland, harassing German columns and strafing vehicles on the roads. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, had been systematically depleted over months of air combat and strategic bombing. German generals had known that air superiority would likely belong to the Allies, but knowing it in abstract terms and experiencing it as your division moves toward battle were two entirely different matters. Meyer ordered his units to move during daylight hours when possible, taking calculated risks, because every hour of delay meant that the Allies consolidated their beachhead further. The road to Normandy became a study in friction and chaos. The routes that connected Belgium and eastern France to the Norman coast were shared by multiple German units, all attempting to move toward the invasion zone simultaneously. Supply convoys competed with combat units. Infantry divisions mixed with panzer formations. Rear area units clogged roads that the combat forces needed. Local populations, in some areas, had already received word from radio broadcasts that the invasion was underway. In some Norman villages, French civilians emerged from their homes to watch the columns pass. Their expressions, caught in that moment between hope and fear, were varied. Some seemed to welcome the possibility that liberation might be coming. Others appeared indifferent, inured to occupation and uncertain what invasion might bring. German soldiers, aware that they were moving into combat, focused on the roads and the vehicles ahead and behind them. The Hitler-Jugend division, as it moved toward Normandy, represented something unique in the German order of battle. These were men who had been born after the last war. They had no memory of defeat or the Treaty of Versailles. They had known only Nazi rule, Nazi schools, Nazi youth organizations. The Hitler Youth Organization had taken them when they were children and had shaped them systematically toward military service. Now, the first major test of their training and their indoctrination was about to arrive. Meyer watched his columns moving along the roads with the careful eye of a professional soldier. He noted the bearing of the men, the condition of the vehicles, the efficiency with which supply echelons maintained pace with combat units. By the standards of the Wehrmacht and the SS at this stage of the war, the Hitler-Jugend division remained an impressive formation. Equipment was modern, training had been thorough, morale, at least on the surface, appeared high. Whether the fanaticism that Meyer had cultivated in his men would translate into military effectiveness against an enemy with superior numbers and weapons remained to be seen. The first rumors of the scale of the invasion began circulating through the division as it continued its movement toward Normandy. Messages indicated that the Allies had landed not just at one point, but at multiple beaches across a wide frontage. Airborne troops had been dropped inland. Naval forces of unprecedented scale were offshore. Some officers who had served in France during the 1940 campaign remembered the speed with which the French army had been defeated and began to wonder, in guarded conversations, whether the situation that was developing might prove similarly catastrophic. Such doubts were dangerous in the SS. Meyer would have been aware of them. He would have assessed his subordinates for any signs of defeatism, but he himself, at this stage, did not appear to be seized by despair. He had been a soldier since the late 1920s. He had survived campaigns in Poland and the Soviet Union. He had built a reputation as a tactician and a leader who could extract maximum effort from his men. The invasion, for all its magnitude, was simply the next battle. The task was to get his division to Normandy, to concentrate his forces, and to attack. By the evening of the 6th of June, the Hitler-Jugend division was in motion on the roads between Belgium and Normandy, still some distance from the actual beachhead. Other German units were closer and were already engaging Canadian forces near the beach, designated as Juno, where the invasion forces had established their first fragile foothold. The Hitler-Jugend would not arrive until the following day. Meyer rode with his headquarters, coordinating movement with higher command, receiving updates on the situation as it developed. The invasion that Hitler had feared and that German planners had theorized about was now reality. The defenses that had been built and reinforced were now being tested. The static positions that had seemed so formidable in the preceding months were proving less valuable than anticipated against an enemy that had achieved tactical surprise and possessed overwhelming force. The movement of the Hitler-Jugend division toward Normandy on the 6th of June and into the following day represented the beginning of Meyer's most consequential period as a commander. His division was being committed to a major battle against a determined and well-equipped opponent. The ideological training and the combat training would now merge in actual warfare. The fanaticism that Meyer had cultivated would now confront the professionalism and the firepower of the Canadian and British forces that had landed on the beaches. The choices that Meyer made in the coming days and weeks would define not only his military reputation, but his place in history. The road to Normandy was a road toward a reckoning that neither the young men of the Hitler-Jugend division nor their commander fully anticipated in those first hours of invasion. The scale of what was unfolding became clearer as the day progressed, and reports flowed in from forward units already in contact. The Normandy beachhead was not a localized landing that could be quickly contained and driven back into the sea. It was the opening phase of a continental invasion designed to break Nazi Germany's hold on Western Europe. The forces involved were vaster than anything that most German soldiers had encountered. The commitment was total. The outcome would determine the future of Europe and the fate of millions of people. Meyer, moving with his division toward the sound of the guns, was about to become a central figure in the most consequential battle of the Western campaign. The hours and days immediately ahead would test him as he had never been tested before, and would place him at the center of events that would shape the final year of the war in Western Europe. The invasion had come at dawn on the 6th of June, 1944, with a force and fury that shattered the illusions the Wehrmacht had maintained for 4 years. Intelligence reports had warned of an attack, but the scale, the coordination, and the sheer logistics of what the Allies launched across the Norman coast caught the German High Command in a state of confusion that would never fully resolve. For Kurt Meyer, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the morning brought an alert that transformed months of preparation into the sudden, violent reality of modern industrial warfare. The division was stationed in Belgium at that moment, one of several panzer reserves positioned to respond to an invasion that everyone knew was coming, yet no one seemed prepared to face. Meyer received his orders to move toward Normandy in the early hours after the landings had begun, and he moved with the decisiveness that had become his trademark. The roads toward the invasion zone were already congested with other military traffic, and intelligence arriving at his command post was fragmentary, often contradictory, and painted a picture of a situation far more catastrophic than the optimistic assessments coming from higher headquarters suggested. Meyer's reputation as a bold tactical commander meant he was expected to restore order from chaos, to coordinate the panzer forces arriving piecemeal to the bocage, and stop an invasion that was already consolidating its grip on French soil. The journey from Belgium to Normandy in those first days after the invasion was an education in the new reality of warfare in Northern Europe. The roads were under constant air attack from Allied fighter bombers that commanded the skies with an almost casual supremacy. Meyer's column moved by night when possible and endured the terror of daytime movement during daylight hours, watching German vehicles burn on the roadsides, their crews incinerated or scattered into the Norman hedgerows. The logistical situation was deteriorating by the hour. Supply lines that should have been feeding panzer divisions with fuel, ammunition, and replacement crews were themselves under attack, and could barely deliver enough to keep the forces already engaged from grinding to a halt. Meyer arrived in the sector near Caen on the 10th of June, 4 days after the landings, and what he found was not the orderly deployment of a powerful reserve striking force, but rather a chaotic collection of damaged units, exhausted men, and commanders trying to piece together tactical responses from fragmented intelligence and dwindling resources. The initial German counterattacks against the beachhead had failed. The Allies had come ashore with an overwhelming air superiority that made any large-scale German movement during daylight an exercise in suicide. Meyer quickly understood that the assumption upon which the entire German defensive strategy rested, that the Wehrmacht could identify and crush the invasion in its first hours, had already been proven false. The Hitlerjugend division under Meyer's operational control consisted largely of teenagers who had spent their entire lives under Nazi rule, trained in fanaticism as well as military technique, armed with modern panzer tanks and supported by anti-tank guns and infantry. These were not jaded veterans like some of the older SS formations, hardened by years on the Russian front. They were ideologically committed, physically fit, and in many cases, absolutely convinced that their generation would reverse the military catastrophe that was befalling Germany. Meyer himself was the embodiment of what the SS wanted its commanders to be: aggressive, professional in his tactical approach, respected by his men, and fundamentally committed to the ideology that had built the Third Reich. His very presence was meant to stiffen morale and impose order. Yet the reality he encountered in Normandy was profoundly different from the scenarios that had been gamed in training exercises. The enemy did not come in predictable formations that could be flanked or encircled. The Canadians and British were not static targets, but rather forces with their own mobility, their own air support, and intelligence that seemed to anticipate German movements almost before the Germans themselves knew what they were doing. Meyer's first days in Normandy were spent trying to understand a tactical situation that was fundamentally chaotic and rapidly deteriorating, while simultaneously attempting to coordinate forces that were arriving in piecemeal fashion and taking heavy casualties from air attack during movement. The initial engagements between the Hitlerjugend Division and Canadian forces near Caen began on the 10th and 11th of June, almost immediately after Meyer's arrival in the sector. The Canadians, having broken out from their beachhead at Juno, were pushing inland with the objective of taking Caen and establishing a consolidated bridgehead. The Hitlerjugend was thrown in to block this advance and attempt to contain or push back the Canadian forces before they could fully consolidate their position. These early battles were marked by intense fighting in the hedgerow country of Normandy, where the terrain itself became an ally to both sides. The high hedges and sunken roads that had characterized Norman agriculture for centuries suddenly became fortifications, ambush points, and obstacles to armor movement that the Germans had not fully appreciated during their planning. Meyer's panzer tactics, which had been developed for the open steppes of Russia or the relatively flat terrain of Poland and France during the 1940 invasion, had to be adapted on the fly to combat conditions where visibility was limited to a few dozen meters and where infantry could destroy tanks from nearly point-blank range. The experience was sobering, and the casualties mounted quickly as the first real combat test of Meyer's division revealed weaknesses in training, command and control, and the simple fact that no amount of ideological commitment could substitute for the kind of battle-hardened experience that the Wehrmacht had lost on the Russian front. Communications between Meyer's command post and his forward units became increasingly difficult as the fighting intensified. Radio discipline, which had been drilled into every commander, began to break down under the pressure of combat. Reports arriving at Meyer's headquarters were often delayed, sometimes contradictory, and occasionally simply false, as units under fire made estimates about enemy strength and positions that reflected panic as much as accurate observation. The German command structure above Meyer, the Corps and Army-level headquarters, was itself being overwhelmed by the sheer pace of the invasion and the rapidity with which the situation was changing. Orders would arrive from higher command that bore little relation to the tactical reality on the ground. Meyer would be told to hold positions that were already being flanked, or to counterattack with forces that had been decimated in the previous day's fighting and were busy reorganizing and treating casualties. The tension between what Meyer was ordered to do and what was actually possible with the forces he had available created a grinding pressure that exposed the limitations of even the most gifted commanders. Meyer's reputation as a bold tactical commander meant that he was given considerable latitude in how to accomplish his orders, but this freedom of action could not substitute for the simple reality that the Germans were outnumbered, outgunned, and fighting an enemy that controlled the air and could reinforce losses far faster than Germany could. The first week of Meyer's command in Normandy saw the Hitlerjugend Division take losses that were unsustainable over any length of time. The initial enthusiasm of the younger soldiers, their fanatical willingness to attack regardless of odds, proved both a strength and a catastrophic weakness. They attacked with a recklessness, born partly from ideology and partly from the simple fact that many of them had never experienced defeat, or the kind of sustained combat that teaches soldiers caution and survival. Meyer himself was often found at the front, observing positions, directing fire, and attempting through force of personality and example to maintain the momentum of his division's operations. His presence was meant to inspire, and in many cases it did, but inspiration alone could not overcome the physical destruction that the Canadian and British artillery and air power were inflicting on German formations. By the 15th of June, just 9 days after Meyer's arrival in Normandy, the Hitlerjugend division had already suffered several thousand casualties, had lost a significant portion of its tank strength, and had achieved nothing approaching the kind of breakthrough that might have disrupted the Allied invasion. Meyer was ordering attacks that seemed increasingly desperate, designed now not to crush the invasion, but merely to prevent the Allies from expanding their beachhead beyond what had already been established. The intelligence situation facing Meyer was dire and only grew worse as the campaign continued. German aerial reconnaissance had virtually ceased, as the Luftwaffe no longer had the strength to challenge Allied air superiority over Normandy. The Germans were forced to rely on reports from forward observers, on radio intercepts, and on the fragmentary information that could be gleaned from prisoners of war and captured documents. Much of this intelligence proved to be inaccurate, as the Allies were actively conducting deception operations and were careful to conceal the true strength and disposition of their forces. Meyer often found himself attacking what he believed to be weakly held positions, only to discover that the Canadians and British had concentrated far more strength than intelligence had indicated. These repeated surprises created a spiral of diminishing confidence in the intelligence system and increasing reliance on aggressive action to find out where the enemy actually was and how strong they actually were. This in turn led to higher casualties among his own troops and further depletion of his forces. The ironclad certainty that had characterized Nazi planning before the invasion was giving way to a kind of frantic improvisation in which commanders at Meyer's level were expected to accomplish the impossible with inadequate resources and incomplete information. By the middle of June, Meyer was operating in a command environment that was defined more by crisis management than by any coherent operational plan. His division was split up, with elements scattered across a wide area of the Bocage, fighting what amounted to a series of local battles against a Canadian advance that seemed relentless and well-coordinated. Orders from higher headquarters continued to arrive, but they often seemed designed to be executed in a dream world that bore little relation to the actual state of German forces and the actual capabilities of the men available to carry them out. Meyer's response was to focus on what could actually be accomplished at the division level, disrupting enemy movement, inflicting casualties when opportunities presented themselves, preventing any breakthrough that might allow the Allies to break out of Normandy, and attempting to preserve enough of his division to remain a coherent fighting force. He was acutely aware that the longer the Germans remained bogged down in Normandy without achieving a breakthrough, the worse the strategic situation would become. The Allies had unlimited replacements, unlimited supplies, and complete control of the air. Germany had neither. Every day that the Hitlerjugend remained engaged in a grinding attritional battle was a day that the Wehrmacht was losing the race against time. Yet Meyer had no choice but to fight the war that was actually occurring, rather than the war that German planning had assumed would occur. The relationship between Meyer and his subordinate commanders during these first desperate weeks in Normandy began to reveal cracks that would grow wider as the campaign continued. Some of the junior SS officers commanding companies, platoons, and even battalions of the Hitlerjugend showed a fanaticism that went beyond mere military professionalism. For them, orders from Berlin about how prisoners should be treated, about the ideological nature of the struggle against the Allies, and about the necessity of maintaining racial and political purity, even in the midst of combat, carried weight equal to, or greater than, the tactical necessities of the moment. Meyer's focus was on military effectiveness, on killing the enemy, and on preserving his command. But the ideological fervor of some of his subordinates sometimes pulled toward actions that served no immediate military purpose, and that violated the conventions of warfare that even the Nazi regime theoretically acknowledged. Meyer was not unaware of this tension, and he did not particularly care to intervene when the enthusiasm of his junior officers exceeded the bounds of what the Geneva Conventions might have permitted. The Wehrmacht had long ago learned to look the other way when SS units committed atrocities, and Meyer had risen through a command structure that had normalized the idea that SS soldiers operated under different rules than regular Wehrmacht troops. The Canadian forces opposing Meyer's division in these first weeks of combat were themselves learning the nature of the enemy they faced. The Hitlerjugend division fighters displayed a tactical skill and a willingness to fight that in many cases exceeded what Canadian soldiers had expected from German soldiers at that stage of the war. The expectation, born partly from propaganda and partly from the documented fact that Germany was losing the war, was that German forces would be demoralized and ready to surrender. Instead, Meyer's division fought with a ferocity that suggested the indoctrination of an entire generation had in fact produced soldiers who were willing to die rather than be captured or retreat. The Canadian battalions pushing toward Caen in the middle of June found their advance contested at every hedgerow, every sunken road, and every small village by an enemy that seemed determined to make them pay for every meter of ground. The momentum of the invasion had been maintained by the sheer overwhelming numbers and firepower of the Allies, but progress had been slower and more costly than had been hoped. Meyer's division, despite its losses and despite its inexperience, had achieved something. It had slowed the expansion of the beachhead and had inflicted enough casualties that the Canadian advance was becoming more cautious. By the end of the third week of combat in Normandy, Meyer had established himself as the principal operational commander responsible for holding the sector against the Canadian advance toward Caen. His division was scattered and battered, but he had maintained a kind of tactical order from the chaos. Reports of his combat leadership were reaching higher headquarters, and his reputation as a bold and effective commander was being reinforced by the fact that the Hitlerjugend division had not simply collapsed or disintegrated, despite the overwhelming superiority of the Allies in material, air power, and numbers. Meyer was being hailed in some quarters as one of the bright spots in the German defense, a commander who was doing everything that could be done with the forces he had available. Yet beneath this tactical success lay the beginning of a darker chapter. Some of the men under his command had begun to take prisoners in ways that diverged sharply from the conventions of warfare. Stragglers from the Canadian advance, soldiers separated from their units, men who had been wounded and captured. Some of these men were being murdered rather than held as prisoners. The reports of these incidents were reaching Meyer's headquarters, and while he did not actively encourage such actions, he was also making no serious effort to stop them. The machinery of an atrocity was beginning to turn, and Meyer, the bold tactical commander concerned primarily with military effectiveness, was already complicit in actions that would one day be examined by a military court and would result in a verdict that would end his life. In the pre-dawn darkness of the 9th of June 1944, 3 days after the invasion, beaches erupted with gunfire and diesel exhaust. The Canadian 3rd Infantry Division was consolidating its position near the Norman village of Orthy. The men were exhausted, their uniforms caked with chalk dust from the cliffs and blood from comrades who would never leave France. They had pushed inland against sporadic German resistance, but the countryside around Caen remained a maze of bocage, those dense hedgerows that turned every field into a potential fortress. The Canadian commanders believed they could seize the city by the end of the second day. They were catastrophically wrong. What awaited them was not merely tactical defeat, but something far darker, a calculated slaughter of men who had already surrendered, a stain on the record of the Hitlerjugend division that would outlast the Reich itself. The question of who ordered it, who executed it, and who bore ultimate responsibility would haunt Kurt Meyer for the rest of his life. The Hitlerjugend division had arrived in the Normandy sector only days before, rushed forward by Hitler's personal order to crush the invasion at the beachhead. Meyer, now serving as a commander of considerable authority, coordinated the division's movements with a tactical brilliance that briefly earned the respect even of German general officers. The division's strength lay in its armor, Mark IV and Panther tanks that outgunned their Canadian counterparts in raw firepower, and in the fanatical commitment of its young soldiers. Most were barely more than teenagers, men who had spent their entire conscious lives inside the Hitler Youth apparatus, subjected to endless hours of Nazi ideology wrapped around military training. They had been told that the Allies were subhuman invaders, bent on destroying the German nation. They believed it. They had been told that surrender was dishonor, and that prisoners of war were mouths that consumed supplies needed by the front line. Many believed that too. The division's officers, many of them SS men who had fought in Russia, understood the machinery of terror and knew that fear was a weapon that could be wielded with as much precision as a tank gun. The Canadians pushed toward Orthy on the 9th of June, with their armor and infantry moving in coordination, along roads and through fields still scarred from the invasion bombardment. They encountered German positions, tank destroyers, entrenched infantry, anti-tank guns, and fought through them with the determined professionalism of troops who had trained extensively for exactly this kind of operation. But the Germans were not retreating. They were trading space for time, while the armor reserves moved into position to strike. By late afternoon, elements of the Hitlerjugend division's armored strength converged on the Canadian position. What followed was a sudden and violent engagement. Tanks on both sides maneuvering through narrow lanes bordered by stone walls, infantry sheltering in ditches, while machine gun fire stitched patterns across the earth. The chaos of close-quarters armored combat where friend and foe were separated by meters and smoke. The Canadians, caught in this mechanical maelstrom, fought hard, but found themselves surrounded. Many were captured. Some surrendered after their positions became untenable. These men, prisoners of war protected by the Geneva Convention, exhausted and frightened but alive, would not reach the rear area. What happened next has been documented through survivor testimony, post-war interrogations, and the judicial proceedings that followed. Approximately 20 Canadian prisoners, possibly more, were taken into custody by soldiers of the Hitlerjugend division in the vicinity of Orthy. These men were separated from the main group of prisoners, moved away from the village, and systematically executed. Some were shot in small groups. Others were killed individually. The method was cold and methodical, not the hot rage of combat killing, but something more calculated. German soldiers later testified that orders had come down from officers stating that prisoners could not be taken, that supplies were insufficient, that the Canadians were committing atrocities, so German soldiers need not concern themselves with the rules of war. Whether these orders came explicitly from Meyer or from officers acting in what they believed to be his intent remains a matter of historical debate. But the responsibility chain led upward through the divisional command structure. Meyer, as a senior commander of the Hitlerjugend division, bore ultimate authority for the actions of his men. The Canadians discovered evidence of the murders within hours. Bodies were found in fields, near farmhouses, in ravines where they had been hastily concealed. Some bore the marks of execution, bullet wounds at close range, sometimes multiple shots to ensure death. The Canadian soldiers who found their comrades murdered reacted with a cold fury that would shape the remainder of the campaign. Officers attempted to maintain discipline, and adherence to military law, but the knowledge of what had happened poisoned the well of restraint. Word spread through the Canadian ranks that the SS were killing prisoners. Whether this knowledge was entirely accurate or became distorted through the chaos of rumor mattered less than the fact that it created an atmosphere of vendetta. The invasion was no longer purely a military campaign. It was becoming personal. Meyer's own testimony and post-war statements provide murky clarity on his knowledge and involvement. He claimed he had not specifically ordered the killing of prisoners and that junior officers had acted on their own initiative or misinterpreted his general directives. He maintained that in the confusion and intensity of the first week of combat, precise control over every unit's actions was impossible. There is truth in this. Modern warfare at the tactical level is inherently chaotic, and commanders cannot possibly oversee every action of every subordinate. Yet Meyer was no ordinary commander. He had spent years cultivating a specific command culture within the Hitler-Jugend division. He had selected officers who embodied SS ideology. He had reinforced the notion that this division was the elite of the elite, bound by ties of ideology and loyalty that superseded ordinary military regulations. He had created an environment where young officers believed that what their commander wanted, even if unspoken, was what mattered most. The murders at Orthy were not aberrations from this culture, they were expressions of it. The Canadian military began immediately to investigate and document the atrocities. Witness statements were gathered from survivors. Medical officers examined bodies and recorded their observations. Intelligence officers interviewed captured German soldiers, some of whom provided information about the orders and the men who had carried them out. The names of specific perpetrators began to accumulate. Junior SS officers whose units had custody of the prisoners, NCOs who had participated in the executions, soldiers who had stood guard while their comrades murdered helpless men. But the investigation also traced the responsibility upward. Meyer's name appeared in connection with orders issued in the period around the murders. Whether those orders explicitly authorized the killing of prisoners or merely created the conditions under which such killing would occur became the crucial legal question. The Canadians understood that to prosecute a commander, they would need to prove either explicit order or a pattern of knowledge and acquiescence that amounted to command responsibility. The massacre at Orthy was not isolated. Within days, similar murders occurred at Bretteville and other locations, as the Hitler-Jugend division continued its operations in Normandy. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Prisoners being separated, moved away from main lines, and executed. German soldiers captured by Canadians sometimes spoke with surprising candor about what had occurred. Some seemed to feel that killing prisoners was now permitted, perhaps even expected. The Canadian soldiers who interrogated them reported a chilling sense that the young SS men they questioned appeared almost proud of their actions, viewing them not as crimes, but as military necessity. This attitude, this complete inversion of the Geneva Convention and the rules of war, suggested something far more systematic than isolated incidents of passion. It suggested that a culture of impunity had been created, that the boundaries between soldier and murderer had been deliberately erased. Yet understanding the distinction between knowing that atrocities occurred and proving command responsibility is the crucial element of justice. Meyer would later face trial for these crimes, and the prosecution would present evidence of his position, his authority, his proximity to the decision-making, and his failure to prevent or punish the murders once they became known. The defense would argue that he could not have personally controlled every subordinate, and that distance in a military hierarchy provided some insulation from absolute responsibility. Courts-martial, by their nature, exist to resolve exactly such questions. What can be stated with certainty is that by mid-June 1944, as the Hitler-Jugend Division continued its combat operations around Caen, the killing of Canadian prisoners had become a known phenomenon to the men in the division. Officers and NCOs were aware of it. The division's command structure, including Meyer, either authorized it, permitted it, or tacitly accepted it through their failure to investigate and punish. The exact category matters for jurisprudence, but perhaps less for understanding the broader truth. The culture that produced the murders was inseparable from the culture that the division's commanders, including Meyer, had deliberately cultivated. The Canadian response was complex and revealing about how war, once launched into criminality, consumes all restraint on both sides. Some Canadian soldiers began taking fewer prisoners from the Hitler-Jugend Division. The killing at Orthy and Bretteville was matched by Canadian revenge killings, not to the same scale and not as systematized, but real nonetheless. Officers on both sides attempted to maintain discipline, but the momentum of atrocity creates its own logic. Once the boundary is crossed, once prisoners are murdered, the entire moral framework that restrains soldiers collapses. This is not moral equivalence. The systematic nature of German killings was far more organized and far more ideologically grounded than Canadian responses. But it is a warning about the mechanics of atrocity. It is not merely a question of individuals with bad character doing bad things. It is about systems that create conditions where bad things become normalized, where young soldiers are indoctrinated to view their opponents as less than human, where chain of command authority becomes a weapon rather than a restraint. As the Normandy campaign continued through June and into July, the evidence of the early massacres accumulated. Canadian intelligence officers maintained meticulous records. Photographs were taken. Bodies were documented. Survivor testimonies were preserved. The Canadian Army understood that after the war, there would be trials, and those trials would require evidence. They were building a case against the Hitler-Jugend Division and its commanders. Meyer continued his operations, fighting a tactical battle against superior Allied numbers and firepower. But the investigation into his command decisions during these early days was beginning. The war would eventually come to an end. Germany would fall. The men who had committed atrocities would face accountability or escape justice. But the murders at Orthy in June 1944 had ensured that Kurt Meyer's name would be forever associated with one of the war's documented war crimes. The events at Orthy stand as a watershed in the Normandy campaign, the moment when the invasion crossed from a military contest bound by historical convention into something darker. They reveal the mechanisms by which ideology, military training, and chain of command authority combine to enable atrocity. They show how young men, raised entirely within a totalitarian system, could be shaped into executioners. They demonstrate that responsibility for mass killing does not rest solely on those who pulled triggers, but extends upward through the chain of command to those who created the culture, issued the orders, and failed to prevent or punish the murders. And they provide, in their terrible clarity, evidence that would ultimately bring Kurt Meyer before a military court to answer for his actions as a commander of the Hitler-Jugend Division. The violence that erupted on the fields near Orthy on the 17th of June was not an isolated incident born from the heat of battle. It was the first terrible manifestation of a pattern, a recurring infection within the Hitler-Jugend Division that would spread across the Norman bocage over the following weeks, leaving Canadian and British soldiers dead in circumstances that went far beyond the brutality of combat itself. What happened at Orthy was shocking enough. What followed suggested something more systematic, more corrosive to the chain of command itself. The killing would continue, And with each incident, the question of Kurt Meyer's knowledge and his response would become more difficult to ignore. By the third week of June, the Hitler-Jugend Division had suffered significant casualties and had failed to drive the Canadians back into the sea. The division was now locked in brutal, grinding combat around the town of Caen and its approaches, where the close terrain of the Norman countryside became a labyrinth of small farms, hedgerows, and villages. Meyer's tanks and panzer grenadiers found themselves fighting not in the open spaces where their mobility gave them advantage, but in the claustrophobic confines of the bocage, where Canadian infantry, using superior tactical discipline and firepower, could pick away at German positions methodically. This environment bred frustration, exhaustion, and in some units, something darker, a willingness to disregard the conventions of warfare that had, until now, maintained at least a veneer of restraint. The breakdown in discipline appears to have been most acute among the younger SS officers and senior non-commissioned officers who had been indoctrinated in the ideology of the Third Reich from childhood. These men had absorbed, over years of Hitler Youth training, the notion that certain enemies, and particularly the British and their allies, represented an existential threat to the Germanic people. Meyer himself had preached this doctrine to his subordinates during the training phase in Belgium. Now, surrounded by comrades dying in the Norman mud, facing an enemy that showed no signs of retreat, some of these officers began to interpret their ideological mission in the most literal and murderous way. They saw Canadian prisoners not as legitimate captives, entitled to protection under the laws of war, but as representatives of an enemy that, in the ideological framework they had been taught, deserved no mercy. On the 18th of June, one day after Orthy, elements of the Hitler-Jugend Division encountered Canadian troops near the village of Bretteville-Lourgueilleuse. The fighting was savage and confused, with Canadian forces taking defensive positions among the stone buildings and fighting with discipline and courage. When German forces broke through, or when Canadian soldiers were captured, a portion of them were executed on the spot, or shortly thereafter. The testimony that would later emerge from Canadian survivors and German witnesses painted a picture of cold, deliberate murder, prisoners being shot or bayoneted after they had surrendered and been disarmed. These killings were not attributed to random acts by individual soldiers overwhelmed by combat stress, but rather to organized groups acting under the apparent sanction, or at minimum, the willful blindness of their immediate commanders. What distinguishes Bretteville from the confusion of Orthy is that the pattern became clearer. Witnesses reported that senior non-commissioned officers and junior officers were directing or participating in the executions. Captured Canadian soldiers reported being marched away from the fighting line and then being shot in small groups, often with methodical efficiency. Some German soldiers who participated would later claim they had been ordered to do so. Others suggested that their officers had simply looked the other way while subordinates committed these acts. The distinction between explicit order, implicit permission, and criminal negligence would become crucial in later legal proceedings. But in the moment, the effect was identical. Canadian prisoners were being murdered with apparent impunity. The period between late June and early July saw further incidents at Mazy and other locations where Hitler-Jugend units encountered Canadian forces. Survivors consistently reported the same pattern: initial resistance, breakthrough or capture, and then the execution of prisoners, often accompanied by an almost ritualistic quality that suggested the killings had become normalized within certain units. German officers and men who participated or witnessed these events later offered various explanations. They claimed they were following standing orders to take no prisoners, that they were responding to alleged Canadian atrocities, or that they were simply overwhelmed by combat stress. What they did not claim, notably, was that they were shocked or horrified by what they saw, or that they had attempted to stop it. Meyer's knowledge of these incidents presents a complex and troubling question. As divisional commander, he received reports from his subordinate unit commanders. Some of these reports made reference, in oblique language, to the handling of prisoners. Meyer toured the front lines during this period, visiting forward positions and observing the combat situation firsthand. It would have been nearly impossible for him not to become aware, through fragmentary reports, rumors among officers, or direct observation, that something beyond conventional warfare was occurring. The military chain of command functioned such that if Meyer had issued explicit orders to stop the killings, they could have been transmitted and enforced. That he did not do so is the core of the question regarding his culpability. What appears to have occurred is not that Meyer actively ordered the massacres, but rather that he created and permitted conditions in which they could occur without serious consequence. He had trained his officers in ideological warfare. He had emphasized the existential nature of the struggle against the Allies. He had cultivated a culture within the division that valorized ruthlessness and military excellence above adherence to international law. When subordinates exceeded even the loose boundaries of what Meyer himself may have tolerated, he did not crack down with visible severity. There were no courts-martial of his own officers that Canadian prisoners witnessed or heard about. There were no harsh disciplinary actions that might have sent a signal to his subordinates that these killings had crossed a line. Instead, the division continued its operations, and the killings continued. The psychological and organizational dynamics at work in the Hitlerjugend division during this period illustrate how military hierarchies can enable atrocity without necessarily orchestrating it from above. Meyer's subordinate officers, men in their 20s and early 30s, who had grown up entirely under Nazi rule, operated under the understanding that their divisional commander valued aggression and fanaticism. They knew that Meyer himself had a fearsome reputation for tactical boldness and for pushing his men beyond conventional limits. When they began executing prisoners, they were, in effect, taking the implicit lessons of their training to their logical extreme. They were becoming the warriors that Meyer and other SS ideologues had been trying to create. Men without hesitation, without mercy, without the constraints of bourgeois morality. Some of these junior commanders may have believed they were acting in accordance with Meyer's intentions, even if no explicit order had been given. Others may have calculated, correctly, that Meyer would neither interfere nor punish them, and some may simply have believed that in a war of annihilation, which is how the SS taught its men to understand the conflict, such actions were not merely permissible, but necessary. The failure of Meyer to intervene decisively when the pattern became apparent constituted a form of permission. In military justice, the doctrine of command responsibility holds that a commander is accountable for the criminal acts of his subordinates if he knew or should have known of those acts and failed to take reasonable steps to prevent them. By late June, Meyer's division had become associated among Canadian forces and within the Canadian prisoner of war community with a reputation for brutality toward captives. The divisions and regiments that would face Hitlerjugend units in combat began to circulate warnings and to prepare their men for the likelihood that surrender might not be safe. This had an immediate tactical consequence. Canadian soldiers, aware that Hitlerjugend often took no prisoners, became less willing to withdraw or to surrender, even when the military situation had become hopeless. They fought harder, held out longer, and caused greater German casualties than they might have otherwise. Meyer's permissiveness regarding war crimes, in other words, did not bring him tactical advantage. It likely increased his own division's losses. The fanaticism he had cultivated was turning against him, creating a cycle of escalating violence that could not be controlled once set in motion. The evidence that emerged from Canadian survivors and German prisoners created, for Meyer and others in his command, a historical record that could not be erased or explained away. Photographs were taken of the sites where bodies were found. Testimony was collected from Canadian soldiers who had escaped or been liberated from German prisoner of war camps. German witnesses, including officers and men from other units, provided corroborating accounts of what they had seen or heard regarding Hitler-Jugend actions. By the time Meyer was captured in May of 1945, the documentation regarding the massacres was substantial. The question of his personal guilt, whether he had ordered these killings or merely permitted them, would become the central dispute at his trial. But what could not be disputed was that under his command, the Hitler-Jugend division had become a unit known for murdering prisoners, and that he had done little or nothing effective to stop it. This escalation phase, spanning from mid-June through early July, represents the point at which the Hitler-Jugend division crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The division had begun as an elite military formation, albeit one that was intensely indoctrinated in Nazi ideology. By the end of June, it had become something else, a formation that had committed systematic war crimes against prisoners and had suffered no meaningful consequences for doing so from its own command structure. Meyer's role in that transformation, through his training methods, his ideological example, and ultimately his failure to intervene, would follow him to the gallows. The fanatical adolescents he had molded into soldiers had learned too well the lessons he had taught them. The summer of 1944 unfolded across Normandy like a slow catastrophe. What had begun as a measured response to invasion, a calculation that German forces could contain and eventually repel the Allies, had become a desperate scramble for survival. By early July, the bocage, that dense labyrinth of hedgerows and sunken roads that had seemed like natural German fortifications, revealed itself as a trap. The very terrain that promised defense became a prison. American and British forces pressed inward from their beachheads with methodical ferocity, while the Canadians, having landed at Juno Beach, surged inland with an aggression that matched anything the Wehrmacht could throw at them. It was into this collapsing situation that Kurt Meyer operated, not as an administrator or rear area commander, but as a frontline officer desperately attempting to salvage coherence from chaos. His Hitler-Jugend division, bloodied by the initial engagement near Caen and further depleted by subsequent firefights, was now the anvil upon which the entire German defense in this sector depended. Meyer's approach to the deteriorating tactical situation was characteristically aggressive. Rather than contract defensively or establish a stable front line, he orchestrated a series of counterattacks intended to disrupt Allied consolidation and create opportunities for breakthrough. These operations were not coordinated by some distant general staff secure in a chateau. They were born from close observation of infantry movements, from conversations with panzer commanders in the field, and from Meyer's own intuitive grasp of mobile warfare. He understood that the Hitler-Jugend, despite its fanatic training and ideological fervor, could not win a war of attrition against an enemy with superior numbers and unlimited supplies. Speed, concentration of force, and ruthless exploitation of momentum were his only levers. Throughout July, Meyer moved constantly between regiment and battalion command posts, exposing himself to artillery fire and small arms, establishing his physical presence as a rallying point for officers and enlisted men alike. His ability to appear at critical moments, to assess a tactical situation instantaneously, and to issue orders that galvanized action became legendary even among fellow SS commanders. Yet these same qualities, this refusal to accept static defense, came at a terrible price, in casualties and in the deepening moral crisis within his division. The massacre investigations that had begun in June did not slow Meyer's operational tempo. If anything, they became a secondary concern, a legal matter to be managed, while the primary struggle for survival continued. Canadian investigators had begun documenting the murders of prisoners at Orthy and elsewhere, collecting testimonies from survivors, and examining mass grave sites. Intelligence summaries passed upward through German command channels hinted that the Canadians were aware of these acts. Some senior Wehrmacht officers expressed alarm. Rumors circulated among junior SS officers that there might be consequences. Yet Meyer's response was not contrition or intervention to prevent future occurrences. It was determination to ensure that the larger tactical mission superseded any inquiry. To address the killings directly would be to acknowledge command failure, to suggest that his authority had fractured, that his hand-picked officers had operated outside legitimate military bounds. Better, in Meyer's calculus, to move forward, to demonstrate that the division remained effective and disciplined, to show that its combat record spoke for itself. This compartmentalization was not unique to Meyer. It was the standard operating procedure of the SS officer corps. But in his case, it enabled a continuation of atrocity under the guise of military necessity. By mid-July, Meyer's division held a sector near the village of Orthy itself, the same location where the murders had occurred barely 3 weeks earlier. The ground was still marked by the graves and the disturbance of soil, where bodies had been hastily interred. Canadian prisoners, who had been taken and then executed, had been local men, soldiers, who had names and families and futures that would never materialize. Yet for Meyer and his staff, Orthy was now simply a defensive position, a strong point to be held or abandoned based on tactical calculation. The bocage terrain in that region was extraordinarily difficult. German positions existed in a three-dimensional lattice of hedgerows, sunken farm roads, and small woods where visibility rarely exceeded 100 meters. Armor could not move freely. It had to be used in small groups, often at point-blank range, exposed to anti-tank fire from concealed positions. Infantry fighting was hand-to-hand, often at night, in conditions of absolute confusion. Meyer's solution was to maintain aggressive patrolling, to establish rapid reaction forces that could surge out of positions, to catch Allied movements at vulnerable moments, and to use every scrap of available armor, which by July amounted to a few dozen Panthers and Mark IV tanks, scattered among various subunits, in concentrated thrusts aimed at local tactical objectives. These were not grand maneuvers. They were small unit actions, sometimes involving no more than a platoon of tanks and a few squads of infantry. Yet they consumed men and materiel at a rate that the Hitlerjugend could not sustain. Meyer's tactical ingenuity was matched by a hardening pragmatism about what his men could achieve. Unlike many German commanders, who clung to expectations of eventual counteroffensive or breakthrough, Meyer understood by mid-July that the strategic situation was lost. The Allies controlled the air absolutely. German panzer movements were spotted by reconnaissance aircraft and reported to artillery within minutes. The continued arrival of fresh Allied divisions, American, British, Canadian, even Polish units, created mathematical impossibility of German victory. Supply lines to the Normandy beachhead were stretched thin, fuel was rationed, and the promise of reinforcements from elsewhere on the Western Front, or from the East, proved illusory. Yet even as this reality sank in, Meyer continued to fight with undiminished intensity, not because he believed Germany could win, but because accepting defeat meant accepting collapse of the entire worldview in which he had invested his life. The SS, and particularly the combat divisions within the SS, had styled themselves as the guarantors of racial survival, the vanguard of a new Europe. To retreat, to accept the inevitability of German defeat, was to admit that this entire ideology had been catastrophically wrong. For a man of Meyer's generation and indoctrination, such admission was psychologically impossible. Instead, he fought harder, demanded more of his men, and projected an image of indomitable will, even as the situation deteriorated beyond recovery. The Canadian forces opposing Meyer's sector grew stronger through July. What had begun as scattered battalions consolidated into brigade and divisional strength units, with supporting artillery, armor, and engineering. The Canadian forces were professional, disciplined, and motivated by something beyond ideological fervor. They were soldiers who wanted to survive, to go home, and who had learned through bitter experience that German soldiers fought better when they were frightened or cornered. Meyer's men, by contrast, were increasingly exhausted and demoralized. The initial fanaticism of the Hitler Youth recruits, the sense that they were part of a grand historical mission, had been worn away by sleepless nights, constant bombardment, and the sight of friends torn apart by artillery fire. Meyer's officers kept the men in line through a combination of leadership example and the implied threat of court-martial, or worse, for dereliction. The division maintained its cohesion as a fighting force, but the cohesion was now that of a professional military unit, not an ideological movement. The young men who had enlisted in the Hitlerjugend division with visions of glory had been transformed into soldiers, fighting simply to survive the next hour, the next day, the next week. Through this period, Meyer continued to receive reports of Canadian allegations regarding the massacres. Some information came through normal intelligence channels. Other reports were more fragmentary, picked up from overheard conversations or from officers who had visited division headquarters and learned of the investigations. Meyer's response was characteristic. He neither denied the incidents nor took responsibility for them. Instead, he constructed a narrative of military necessity and chaos in battle. In this version of events, prisoners had been killed in the confusion of combat, or while allegedly attempting to escape, or in response to Canadian atrocities against German prisoners. This was partly the standard SS defense mechanism: blame the enemy, invoke the fog of war, deny systematic intent. But it also reflected a genuine uncertainty within German command about whether Allied forces were taking prisoners at all, or whether they were executing captured Germans in reprisal for actions like those at Orthy. Such uncertainty, whether justified or not, provided psychological cover for German officers who wanted to believe that their men were not committing atrocities, but rather responding to a savage enemy in kind. Meyer allowed this narrative to persist within the Hitlerjugend division, and in so doing, he condoned the killing of prisoners as an acceptable wartime practice. As July turned into August, Meyer's tactical situation deteriorated further. The encirclement at Falaise was beginning to take shape as American and Canadian forces pressed deeper into Normandy and began to wheel eastward, threatening to cut off the entire German force from behind. Meyer was aware of this danger, as any competent commander had to be, and he began to prepare contingency plans for withdrawal. Yet withdrawal, in the context of German military culture and Nazi ideology, was not a neutral word. It implied failure, abandonment of German soil, and ultimately the admission that the Reich could not defend itself. For Meyer, personally, the strategic collapse represented something more immediate and terrifying: the likely end of the SS as an institution, the possibility of execution if captured by enemies who knew of the massacres, and the total negation of the worldview that had sustained him through his adult life. Psychologically, Meyer responded to this pressure by becoming even more aggressive tactically, as if the intensity of his efforts in the present moment could somehow reverse the inexorable strategic consequences of the past weeks. His orders became more demanding, his expectations of subordinates more exacting, and his tolerance for failure or hesitation less forgiving. Meyer's relationship with his division's political officer and SS hierarchy became increasingly complex during this period. The SS structure maintained parallel chains of command, one based on military rank and tactical function, the other based on party loyalty and ideological commitment. Meyer was secure in his military authority, respected by his officers and men as a combat commander who delivered results. Politically, however, his position was more precarious. The knowledge of the massacres, the investigations being conducted by both German and Canadian authorities, and the general chaos of the crumbling front created opportunities for ambitious subordinates to establish themselves as more politically reliable. Meyer had to maintain the loyalty of his division while simultaneously protecting himself from accusations that he had failed to prevent or punish the killings of prisoners. This balancing act required constant attention, subtle management of information flow, and the careful cultivation of relationships with senior SS and Wehrmacht commanders, who might determine his fate if the war continued or ended in different ways. Meyer proved adept at this political maneuvering, cultivating a reputation as an officer who got results, and allowing others to provide the ideological justification for methods that might otherwise be questioned. The human cost of Meyer's command during this period was staggering. The Hitlerjugend division had arrived in Normandy with approximately more than 20,000 men. By early August, it had suffered at least 7,000 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. This represented roughly 35% of the division's fighting strength, lost in approximately 6 weeks of combat. Yet the division continued to receive a trickle of replacements, mostly older men transferred from other units, which meant that the character of the division was gradually changing from a Hitler Youth formation to a more heterogeneous military unit. Meyer's leadership ensured that despite this hemorrhaging of personnel and the constant strain of operations, the Hitlerjugend division maintained its reputation as one of the most effective German formations in Normandy. It was a Pyrrhic achievement in the context of overall German strategic collapse, but it was achievement nonetheless. Meyer had demonstrated that his theories of aggressive panzer leadership could be executed effectively, even against a superior enemy. The cost, however, the lives consumed, the atrocities committed under his command, the young men destroyed for a cause already lost, would haunt the memory of this period long after the war ended. By the final days of July, with the Falaise encirclement becoming imminent, Meyer began to recognize that his Normandy campaign was approaching its climax. The division, though badly damaged, remained under his command and still possessed some combat capability. His orders continued to emphasize defense and counterattack, though increasingly these orders came with hints of eventual withdrawal. Meyer made no dramatic statements about the fate of the division or the broader German cause. Instead, he occupied himself with the immediate tactical problems, maintaining unit cohesion, managing the flow of supplies, and positioning the division to either stabilize the front or, if necessary, to withdraw in good order. In this final phase of the Normandy campaign, Meyer embodied the SS officer at the moment of the Third Reich's military collapse, still technically in command, still issuing orders that men obeyed, still capable of projecting authority and decisiveness. Yet he and everyone around him understood, with an understanding that existed beneath words and official pronouncements, that the military situation was no longer retrievable. What remained was to manage the disintegration, to preserve as much as possible of the division's combat capability and to ensure personal survival through the chaos that was about to engulf Normandy entirely. The investigations into the massacres continued through this entire period, but they operated on a slower timeline than the military crisis. Canadian intelligence officers collected testimonies, examined physical evidence, and built files on suspected perpetrators. These investigations would eventually prove crucial to Meyer's post-war prosecution, but in the moment, in the summer of 1944, they were secondary to the urgency of immediate military survival. Meyer was aware of them, surely, and he took steps to manage the information flow and to ensure that blame for the killings could be diffused across multiple officers and units. But the investigations did not immediately threaten his command authority or his physical safety. The Hitlerjugend division still needed him. The war was still ongoing. The machinery of military justice was slow and cumbersome, even in the best circumstances. For Meyer, command remained an exercise in the present moment, in the tactical demands of the bocage, in the management of exhausted men facing an enemy that could not be defeated. The reckoning for what had been done in June, the full accounting of responsibility for the deaths of Canadian prisoners, would come later, after the fighting ended and the investigations could proceed uninterrupted by the noise of artillery and the urgency of tactical crisis. For now, Meyer remained the commander, and Normandy remained the arena in which his mastery of mobile warfare was being tested against an enemy with greater resources and the capacity to sustain losses indefinitely. By the first week of August in 1944, the German military situation in Normandy had transformed from desperate into catastrophic. The Hitlerjugend division under Meyer's command had been bleeding men and machines for 2 months, in a grinding attritional struggle against Canadian and British forces in the bocage. Panzer losses mounted daily, and the division's tanks that had once rolled off assembly lines in gleaming formation now sat as smoking hulks in the Norman hedgerows. Meyer's remaining Panzer grenadiers, many of them barely 20 years old, fought with fanatical determination, born partly from indoctrination and partly from the simple fact that surrender to Canadian forces now carried the unspoken penalty of revenge. The larger strategic picture was far worse than Meyer could have fully grasped from his divisional command post. 2 American armies under General Omar Bradley and the British forces under Field Marshal Montgomery had established themselves firmly on the continent, and the Allies were preparing to execute a massive encirclement that would trap German forces in a closing pocket near the town of Falaise. The trap was set by mid-August, though the German High Command's response remained fragmented and slow. To the north, near Caen, British and Canadian forces pressed southward in a grueling campaign that had cost them thousands of casualties, but had steadily pushed the Germans back from their coastal positions. Meanwhile, American forces, under General Wade Hyslop, had pushed east and then north from their position near Le Mans, driving toward Alençon in a wide sweeping movement designed to encircle the entire German force in Normandy. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, the German commander in France, recognized the danger but lacked the resources and, more fundamentally, the authority to execute a coordinated withdrawal. Hitler, commanding from his distant headquarters, had issued contradictory orders that first demanded the Germans counterattack toward the coast, and then, when that proved impossible, demanded that they hold their positions regardless of the encirclement forming around them. Meyer, like many other divisional commanders, found himself locked in a vice, with no clear orders on how to escape it. The Hitlerjugend division's position, near Falaise, put it almost directly in the path of the encirclement's closing jaws. Meyer's remaining combat strength consisted of perhaps 30 panzer tanks, scattered elements of panzer grenadier companies, and a few artillery batteries that had somehow survived the previous weeks of carnage. These men and machines were strung out across a defensive line that Meyer had been forced to stretch thinner and thinner as losses accumulated and no reinforcements arrived from higher command. The division had arrived in Normandy with nearly 1,800 personnel across its panzer battalion and had lost a terrible proportion of them. Young officers whom Meyer had personally trained and promoted had been killed or wounded and evacuated. The sense of invincibility that had surrounded this elite SS formation was utterly gone, replaced by a grim awareness that survival, not victory, was now the only realistic objective. Meyer moved between his remaining command posts by car and motorcycle, directing local counterattacks and attempting to maintain some semblance of coordinated defense as the noose tightened around his division. By August 16th, the American and Canadian forces were closing the gap near Chambois and Troun, two villages just north and west of Falaise that would become the focal point of the encirclement's deadly closure. Meyer received orders to hold his sector and to prevent American forces from breaking through to link up with the Canadians, even as intelligence reports made clear that the German forces to his west were now completely surrounded. The Falaise Pocket, as it would become known, contained tens of thousands of German troops, perhaps 120,000 men or more, all of whom faced either destruction or capture if they did not escape the tightening circle. For Meyer and his divisional staff, the calculation became one of ruthless pragmatism. The division could not fight its way out through the American lines to the south because it lacked the armor strength and the fuel to sustain such an operation. The only viable escape route lay to the north, where a narrow corridor still existed between the Canadian forces pressing south from near Falaise and the American and French forces closing from the south and east. This corridor would close within days, perhaps within hours, if the Allies could coordinate their advance effectively. Meyer's decision to orient the division's withdrawal northward toward this shrinking corridor reflected the brutal calculus that now governed all German operations in Normandy. He coordinated with divisional staff and with the few other SS and Wehrmacht commanders still capable of exercising tactical control over their formations. The retreat would have to be conducted under fire, harassed constantly by Allied artillery and aircraft that now owned the skies above Normandy completely. German anti-aircraft guns had long since been destroyed or captured, and the Luftwaffe was nowhere to be seen, its fighters consumed in previous campaigns or held back for the defense of the Reich itself. Meyer ordered the division to prepare for a night withdrawal, staggering his forces so that some units would suppress enemy fire while others extracted themselves from their positions. This was ancient military doctrine, but executing it with teenage panzer grenadiers who had been fighting continuously for 2 months was a test of both leadership and the discipline that had been so carefully instilled in them during their training. The withdrawal itself began on the night of August 16th and continued through the 17th and 18th of August in a chaotic stream of vehicles, men on foot, and the handful of remaining tanks moving northward through a landscape already thick with refugees fleeing the fighting. Meyer remained with his command element throughout the retreat, exposing himself to fire just as he demanded his men do, a leadership approach that earned him the respect of his officers, even as it exposed him to constant danger. The roads leading northward were choked with traffic from other German units attempting the same escape. Supply trucks, ammunition carriers, ambulances filled with wounded, and soldiers on foot all competed for road space in what quickly descended into something approaching organized chaos. Allied aircraft attacked the columns constantly, and German machine gunners and riflemen returned fire with the desperation of men who knew they had only hours left to escape. The German artillery batteries that had been positioned to support the division's defense now laid down smoke screens and fired counter-battery missions to suppress Allied fire, buying a few more hours of relative safety for the withdrawing columns. By the morning of August 18th, Meyer's division had managed to extract itself across the northern boundary of the Falaise pocket and was moving deeper into territory still held by German forces. The cost of the withdrawal was enormous. The division left behind several hundred casualties who could not be evacuated, damaged tanks that could not be repaired in the field, and a vast amount of equipment and supplies that simply had to be abandoned as the pace of the retreat accelerated. But the core of the division's combat capability, perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 men, had escaped the encirclement and lived to fight another day. Meyer understood that this constituted a tactical success in the context of the larger catastrophe unfolding around him. Other divisions had been less fortunate. The 7th Army under General Paul Hauser had suffered tens of thousands of casualties, with perhaps 15,000 men killed or wounded, and another 50,000 captured when the pocket finally closed completely on August 19th and 20th. Meyer's role in the escape was recognized by the surviving officers and men of the division, and it reinforced his reputation as a tactical commander capable of executing difficult maneuvers under the most challenging circumstances. Yet, this competence and his success in extracting his division from the Falaise pocket stood in sharp and increasingly undeniable contrast to the knowledge, spreading now among Allied commanders, of the massacres his division had committed 6 weeks earlier at Orthy, Bretteville, and other locations near Caen. Canadian intelligence officers and frontline commanders knew that Meyer had been in command when Canadian prisoners of war were murdered by Panzer grenadiers under his authority. As the Falaise pocket closed and the German army in Normandy ceased to exist as an organized force, the men who would eventually try Meyer for war crimes were already compiling evidence and taking statements from survivors. Meyer's narrowly executed escape from Falaise, strategically brilliant as a piece of minor tactics, would soon become evidence in a case against him for something far more serious than military defeat. The escape from Falaise marked the end of the Normandy campaign as a coherent German operation and the beginning of the final German retreat across France. Meyer led what remained of the Hitlerjugend division northeastward toward the Seine River and then beyond it, moving through territory that was collapsing under the weight of the Allied advance. The road network in Normandy and the surrounding regions had been devastated by bombing and by the fighting itself. Towns that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The Norman population that had lived beneath German occupation for 4 years watched in shock as the German army that had conquered France so easily just 4 years earlier now fled in defeat. For Meyer, there was little time for reflection on these larger currents of history. His immediate concern was feeding and supplying the remaining men of his division, maintaining their cohesion, and following whatever orders came from higher command regarding their continued deployment. The war was far from over, and Meyer would continue to command until the very end. But the period of his greatest power and broadest authority had passed with the closing of the Falaise pocket. The human and material losses contained in the Falaise pocket represented a turning point in the German war effort that extended far beyond the tactical situation in Normandy. The German army lost somewhere in the range of 10,000 to 15,000 men killed, and many tens of thousands more captured as the pocket closed in the final days of August. Irreplaceable panzer tanks, assault guns, and self-propelled guns were destroyed or captured. The entire Wehrmacht command structure in France had been decapitated, with senior commanders killed, wounded, or captured. For the SS, and specifically for the Hitlerjugend division, the escape from Falaise was simultaneously a demonstration of Meyer's tactical capabilities and an unspoken acknowledgement that the cause for which these men were fighting was already lost. The ideological fervor that had sustained young SS men could not compensate for the overwhelming superiority in numbers, firepower, and equipment that the Allies now possessed. Yet retreat into a shrinking German territory also meant continued fighting, continued killing, and continued opportunity for the patterns of command and atrocity that had characterized the Normandy campaign to repeat themselves. Meyer's escape from the Falaise pocket meant that he would survive to lead other operations and to make other decisions that would shape the final year of the war. It meant that he would continue to command men, some of them still teenagers, for several more months, until the Reich itself surrendered. It also meant that he would be alive and available to be captured when the war finally ended, setting in motion the legal proceedings and the trials that would eventually bring him to face justice for the crimes committed under his command. The Falaise pocket was a military defeat of historic proportions and a catastrophe for the German army. But for Meyer personally, it was also a narrow escape that allowed him to continue his trajectory toward a date with a Canadian military court and the ultimate penalty for command responsibility in wartime atrocity. By the beginning of August in 1944, the strategic reality facing German forces in Normandy had become unmistakable to anyone willing to see it. The beachhead, which High Command had confidently predicted would be pushed back into the sea within days, had instead grown into a sprawling, reinforced foothold. Allied air superiority had become suffocating. Supply lines from Germany were severed or critically damaged. The Wehrmacht and SS formations that had fought with desperate courage through June and July were now exhausted, undersupplied, and facing encirclement. For Kurt Meyer and the remnants of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, the dream of military triumph had become a struggle for survival. What had begun as a mission to destroy the invasion had transformed into something far more brutal and immediate, a race against collapse. The Falaise pocket, that doomed pocket of German forces being compressed from all sides as American and Canadian armies closed in from west and east, would become the crucible that defined the final act of Meyer's Normandy command. His division, once numbering around 20,000 soldiers when it arrived in France, had been systematically shredded through 7 weeks of continuous combat. Casualties mounted daily. Fresh replacements arrived as green conscripts rather than trained panzer troops. Equipment was cannibalized from destroyed vehicles to keep operational tanks rolling. The rigid hierarchies and ideological certainties that had once bound the Hitlerjugend together were fracturing under the weight of repeated defeat and the mounting evidence that no amount of courage or commitment could change the trajectory of the war. Meyer himself, exhausted and operating under stress that would have broken lesser commanders, remained focused on one singular objective: escape and reform. The withdrawal from Normandy was not a clean military retreat. It was a desperate, grinding movement, rearward, in the face of relentless pursuit. Allied fighter bombers hunted German columns along every available road. The bocage, which had offered such excellent defensive positions for German forces, now became a trap, forcing movement along narrow lanes where vehicles became easy prey. Columns of panzer grenadiers trudged alongside damaged tanks that had to be carefully nursed backward to avoid abandonment. The psychological toll of retreat, particularly for troops who had been trained since childhood to believe in German invincibility, and the righteousness of their cause produced a strange mixture of determination and despair. Men who had fought to the last round of ammunition in defensive positions now faced the more demoralizing task of withdrawal, watching the world of France recede as they moved toward the German border. Meyer's reputation during this period underwent a subtle but significant shift. Among his own officers and men, he remained a respected tactical commander who was making sound decisions under impossible circumstances. His ability to coordinate mobile defense, to extract units from encirclement through calculated risks and precise timing, earned him grudging acknowledgement even from Wehrmacht officers who had initially viewed the SS with contempt. However, a different conversation was beginning in Allied headquarters, particularly among Canadian intelligence officers and those investigating the atrocities that had occurred in Normandy. As German prisoners were interrogated, as survivors gave witness statements, and as Canadian graves registration units documented the locations of murdered comrades, a picture emerged of systematic executions carried out by units under Meyer's direct command. The nickname Panzer Meyer, once a mark of tactical prowess, was beginning to acquire a darker resonance in intelligence reports and prisoner interrogations. The Canadian forces pursuing Meyer's division toward the Seine and beyond were not motivated solely by operational necessity. Many Canadian soldiers and junior officers had direct knowledge of the massacres. They had fought alongside men who had been killed after surrendering. They had uncovered evidence in villages like Orthy and Bretteville of what had been done to their comrades. For them, the pursuit had become personal, in a way that pure military operations rarely are. This undercurrent of knowledge, still fragmentary and not yet conclusively documented, nonetheless created a psychological dimension to the retreat that went beyond standard military pursuit. It was as if two parallel narratives were unfolding simultaneously, one of tactical military operations, the other of gathering evidence and accountability. Meyer, executing his duties with professional competence, was simultaneously becoming a figure of investigation and reckoning. The crossing of the Seine in mid-August 1944 represented a critical turning point in Meyer's operational situation. As his division fought, holding actions on the northern bank, attempting to prevent the Allies from achieving a quick crossing, the senior German command made a series of decisions that would accelerate the catastrophe. Rather than authorizing a general withdrawal across the Seine and into more defensible positions, higher command mounted a desperate counterattack near Mortagne, attempting to cut off the American forces that were racing toward Brittany and threatening to encircle the entire German force in Normandy. Meyer, though recognizing the futility of the operation, received orders to participate. The 12th SS Panzer Division, along with other panzer formations, was committed to an offensive that lacked air cover, lacked adequate supplies, and was being made against an enemy that had already achieved local air and ground superiority. The operation failed, as it inevitably must, and the German forces that had advanced into the Mortagne salient found themselves increasingly threatened with complete encirclement. By late August, the trap was closing rapidly. American forces racing south and east from Brittany, Canadian and Polish forces pushing south from the Caen area, and British forces moving east and south, created a vice that was compressing the remaining German forces in Normandy into an ever-shrinking pocket. The Falaise Pocket, as it would become known to history, was not so much a place as a desperate situation in which tens of thousands of German soldiers found themselves cut off from coherent lines of retreat. Meyer's division, along with elements of other SS and Wehrmacht formations, was caught in the middle of this catastrophe. The choice before Meyer and his immediate superiors was stark. attempt a fighting withdrawal through the narrowing corridors while they still existed, or risk being surrounded and destroyed. Meyer chose action. Through a combination of reconnaissance, personal reconnaissance, and tactical insight, he identified routes through the countryside that might still allow passage eastward. It was not a clean operation. It could not be. The actual breakout from the Falaise pocket involved ferocious hand-to-hand fighting and a ruthlessness that Meyer applied with the same tactical clarity he had displayed throughout his career. Units that could move fast moved in darkness. Heavier elements attempted to suppress Allied positions long enough for columns to pass. The division that emerged on the eastern side of the pocket in late August was a fraction of what it had been. Scattered, shattered. Many soldiers separated from their units, wandering eastward in small groups. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Of the roughly 20,000 soldiers who had arrived in Normandy in June, perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 could be accounted for in organized formations by early September. The remainder were dead, wounded, captured, or separated. Meyer himself, moving through the chaos with a small staff, coordinated the escape with the kind of operational focus that made him an effective commander, but that could not possibly save everything or everyone. The retreat across France into Germany during August and September 1944 was fundamentally different from any previous withdrawal that Meyer had experienced. In Poland, in the Balkans, in earlier operations, retreat had been tactical maneuver, achieved relatively quickly, allowing regrouping and counterattack. This retreat was different. It was the slow, grinding collapse of German military position in Western Europe. Day after day brought new orders to hold line positions, to defend key towns, to buy time for overall German strategy, and day after day, those positions were abandoned as Allied forces flanked them or pushed through gaps in overextended lines. The Hitlerjugend division, reformed into something resembling a coherent unit through the aggregation of surviving elements and the assignment of new conscripts and wounded who could move, staggered eastward. Meyer remained with the unit, giving orders, coordinating with neighboring commands, attempting to impose order on chaos through sheer force of will and military professionalism. It was during this retreat that the investigation into the Normandy massacres began to take on more concrete form. Canadian intelligence officers, working with prisoner interrogations and survivor testimony, were assembling a dossier on the killings at Orthy, Bretteville, and other locations. Meyer's name appeared with increasing frequency in these reports. Subordinates were being questioned about orders that had been given, about the participation of units under his command in executions of prisoners of war, about whether Meyer himself had given explicit authorization or had turned a blind eye to killings that he must have known were occurring. The picture emerging from interrogations was of a commander who, while he may not have personally pulled a trigger, had operated a command structure in which such atrocities had been committed by fanatical junior officers, and had not vigorously suppressed or investigated them. Whether this constituted command responsibility, whether it represented active complicity or passive acquiescence, was beginning to be documented and examined by those who would eventually try him. The German army that retreated into the Rhineland and the Ruhr in September and October 1944 was a force that had lost the initiative entirely. Meyer, now serving in various command capacities with panzer formations in the increasingly desperate defense of German territory, continued to function as a competent professional soldier. He was still capable of executing orders, of coordinating tactical operations, of extracting his commands from difficult situations. But the strategic situation was now beyond repair. The Soviet army was advancing from the east with overwhelming force. The Western Allies had secured France, Belgium, and Holland, and were driving toward Germany's western frontier. From Meyer's perspective, focused as always on operational detail and immediate tactical problems, the war's conclusion was becoming increasingly obvious, even if hope persisted among the Nazi leadership that somehow a miracle weapon or a dramatic reversal might yet alter the outcome. By late 1944 and into 1945, Meyer's whereabouts during certain periods became less clear in the historical record. What is documented is that he continued to hold command positions and that he was involved in defensive operations in the Rhineland and other areas. The whispers about Normandy, the accumulating evidence of war crimes committed by units under his command, and the growing realization that Allied forces would eventually overrun Germany, combined to create a strange twilight period in Meyer's service. He was a professional soldier, executing his duties in a collapsing state. He was simultaneously a figure being sought for investigation into atrocities. He remained focused on the military present, while his past was being meticulously reconstructed by those who would eventually demand accountability. This duality would define the final chapter of his time as a free man and a military officer. The summer of 1944 became a race against time for Kurt Meyer and the shattered remnants of the Hitler-Jugend division. After the catastrophe at Falaise, where the division hemorrhaged men and machines in the closing jaws of Allied encirclement, Meyer found himself commanding not a unified fighting force, but scattered battle groups, holding tenaciously to what remained of German-controlled France. The Normandy campaign had cost the Hitler-Jugend nearly everything. Tanks reduced to burning hulks on Norman fields, the youngest soldiers either dead, wounded, or captured, and the division's combat strength reduced from its full complement of more than 20,000 down to little more than 3,000 effective combatants. Meyer himself emerged from the pocket with a reputation that had begun to fracture beneath the weight of accusations already circulating among Canadian prisoners and intelligence officers. The massacres at Orthy and Bretteville had left a trail of testimony that could not be unwitnessed, and though Meyer maintained his composure and continued to perform his duties as a field commander, the structure of accountability was quietly assembling around him in the shadows of military justice. Through September and into the autumn of 1944, Meyer took command of what German sources sometimes called the 5th SS Panzer Corps, though the designation itself was a measure of desperation as much as military organization. The units under his nominal command were spread thinly across the collapsing Western Front, attempting to stabilize lines that seemed to evaporate beneath them as French, American, and British forces pressed relentlessly eastward. Meyer proved himself a capable tactician even in retreat, orchestrating fighting withdrawals that extracted wounded and remaining equipment when static defense would have resulted only in annihilation. His force conducted operations in the Ardennes and along the Rhine approaches, conducting rearguard actions that bought time for the larger German army to regroup, though the notion of regrouping had become almost phantasmagorical by that point in the war. Officers who served under him during this period later testified that Meyer remained energetic and focused on the military problem at hand, seemingly compartmentalizing the gathering storm of allegations that pursued him through the retreating columns. His operational competence was never in question, only the character of the man who wielded it. The breakthrough into Germany itself occurred in the spring of 1945, when the Wehrmacht's entire strategic situation collapsed into the realm of pure fiction. Meyer and his command were engaged in the Rhineland, attempting to coordinate with other panzer commanders as German defenses became increasingly theoretical rather than actual. By April, with Soviet forces closing from the east and American and British forces driving relentlessly from the west, the Third Reich had perhaps weeks remaining as a functional entity. Meyer received fragmentary orders that made little strategic sense, commands to hold positions that could not be held, to launch counterattacks with forces that no longer existed. He executed what orders he could, with the resources available, but the reality was that the war's outcome had been determined months earlier, and now only the manner and timing of the collapse remained uncertain. Meyer's younger soldiers, many of them the last survivors of the original Hitlerjugend intake, fought with a kind of desperate fatalism, aware that their Third Reich was dying around them. The commandant who had once seemed invincible to these children, now young men, aged beyond their years, was reduced to managing the death throes of an institution that had promised them eternal glory. In May of 1945, with German forces fragmenting and individual commanders making decisions about surrender based on their proximity to advancing armies, Kurt Meyer made the choice that would determine the remainder of his life. Rather than attempt to break through toward the south, where some Wehrmacht units were still engaged, Meyer chose to remain with his remaining command and surrender to the advancing Canadians. This decision was almost surely influenced by calculation. Meyer knew that the Canadians had suffered heavily at the hands of the Hitlerjugend division in Normandy, and that they would be pursuing those responsible with particular determination. Yet he also likely recognized that to attempt to reach the American lines, or to resist further, would only result in his death, or capture by forces who had less immediate reason to keep him alive. On approximately the 11th of May, 1945, just 5 days before the formal German surrender, Meyer and his immediate staff were taken into custody by Canadian forces. The man who had commanded in the exhilaration of the French campaign, who had believed himself part of an elite that would reshape Europe according to racial ideology, now sat in a prisoner of war cage, awaiting whatever judgment the victors would render. The immediate post-war period saw Meyer move through various prisoner facilities, as the Canadian military and intelligence services attempted to gather comprehensive evidence regarding the Normandy massacres. By this point, the magnitude of documented war crimes had begun to organize itself into a clear picture. Testimony from surviving Canadian prisoners, corroborated by German soldiers who had refused to participate in the killings, or who had witnessed them with horror, created an undeniable record. Meyer had not personally pulled a trigger at Orthy or Bretteville, but he had remained in command of the division during the period when the killings occurred, and the pattern of the crimes suggested either his explicit authorization or his deliberate blindness to orders that must have circulated through his command structure. Interrogators found Meyer evasive on the precise details of how orders regarding prisoners were transmitted, whether through formal written command directives or through the kind of tacit understanding that permeates elite military organizations where ideology and brutality have become intertwined. Meyer's defense, to the extent he articulated one during this period, rested on the claim that junior officers had acted beyond his authority, that the fanaticism of Hitlerjugend recruits had exceeded what even an SS commander could control, and that the chaos of active combat operations had prevented him from maintaining the tight discipline necessary to prevent isolated incidents. But the Canadian military authorities were building something far more formidable than a case based on Meyer's direct orders or explicit knowledge. They were constructing an argument based on command responsibility itself, the principle that a commander bears accountability for the actions of his subordinates when those actions are either known and tolerated or the result of orders, spoken or unspoken, that flow from his authority. Military law recognized that commanders cannot be held responsible for every action of every subordinate, but the pattern of atrocities across the Hitlerjugend division in Normandy suggested something more systematic than isolated incidents. The division had acquired a reputation among Canadian forces for particular brutality toward prisoners. and this reputation had been earned through repeated instances, rather than singular aberrations. Moreover, Meyer's own background and statements revealed an ideological commitment to the SS worldview that included a categorical denial of fundamental humanity to enemies designated as subhuman or politically dangerous. The interrogators and intelligence officers understood that they were dealing with a man who had been forged in the furnace of Nazi ideology and who had risen to prominence precisely because he embodied the values the regime sought to cultivate in its military elite. Through the summer and into the autumn of 1945, Meyer remained in custody while legal authorities prepared for formal proceedings. He was transferred to Tinchebray prison in Normandy, held in the very region where his division had committed its crimes, a geographic irony that was surely not lost on anyone involved in the process. Meyer's demeanor during this period was reported as generally calm and professional. He conducted himself as a soldier who understood that he had been defeated and captured, and who awaited the judgment of his captors with a certain resignation. Some guards and interrogators noted that he seemed to accept his fate with a kind of philosophical equanimity, as though he recognized that the machinery of war and politics had rendered his personal agency largely irrelevant. Yet Meyer also seemed to harbor the belief that his military competence and his performance as a tactical commander in the final campaigns might carry some weight in his defense. He had executed his orders and attempted to conduct operations according to military principle, even as the Reich collapsed around him. Perhaps, he may have believed, this professional performance might distinguish him from the more obviously fanatical or sadistic perpetrators of war crimes who populated the prisoner populations. The reality confronting Meyer in the autumn of 1945 was that the international community had already begun to recognize that the industrial machinery of Nazi Germany had generated war crimes on a scale that demanded systematic accountability. The Nuremberg trials were in preparation, and though Meyer himself would not be tried before that tribunal, the principles being established there would frame his own prosecution. The evidence regarding the Hitler-Jugend Division's massacres in Normandy had been gathered and organized by Canadian intelligence officers with meticulous precision. Survivor testimony was being carefully documented and cross-referenced. German soldiers who had participated in the killings or witnessed them were being interrogated, and many were providing detailed accounts that implicated their chain of command. The picture emerging was one of a military organization that had internalized the values of racial ideology so thoroughly that the murder of prisoners was treated as a routine enforcement mechanism rather than a departure from military norms. Meyer, as the division commander at the moment these crimes occurred, occupied a position of central accountability, whether he wished to or not. By early 1946, as Meyer awaited trial, the immediate post-war chaos was beginning to settle into something resembling legal process. The Canadian military authorities had decided to conduct a formal court-martial on charges related to the Normandy massacres. Meyer would be tried not just for his own actions, though shooting of surrendered prisoners or ordering their execution would have been sufficient charges, but for the broader pattern of atrocities that occurred under his command. The trial would require establishing that Meyer either knew of the murders or should have known of them, that he had effective authority over the perpetrators, and that he failed to take action to prevent or punish the crimes. For Meyer, this meant that the summer months in Normandy, the campaign he had viewed as the crucible in which he would prove himself to his superiors,